I stood in the foyer of the custom-built home I paid for, watching my husband of 10 years zip up his leather duffel bag. He did not look at me when he said it. He just kept his eyes on the zipper and muttered that he was leaving me, and that he had been sleeping with my younger sister for the past year. I did not scream or throw his things onto the lawn. I simply picked up my phone, dialed my sister's wealthy white husband, and put him on speakerphone. What happened next made my sister turn pale and shattered my family's perfect facade forever. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to burn down the bridges that were only meant to use you. My name is Jada. I am 35 years old, and for my entire life, I have been the designated problem solver, the financial safety net, and the quiet scapegoat of my family. I built my career as a senior wealth manager through sheer grit, working 80-hour weeks to secure my position at a top financial firm. But in my family, my ambition was often treated as a character flaw, while my money was treated as community property. My husband, Terrence, was 37, a charismatic mid-level corporate sales representative. When we met, I thought his charm was a perfect balance to my serious nature. I did not realize until much later that his charm was merely a mask for a deep-seated insecurity. He loved the luxurious lifestyle my income provided, but he secretly despised the woman who had to work hard to earn it. I just never understood how toxic that resentment had become until a rainy Tuesday evening in late October. I had just walked through the front door, exhausted after a grueling 10-hour day of client meetings and portfolio reviews. The house was completely silent, except for the harsh metallic sound of a zipper coming from the front foyer. I found Terrence standing there, his expensive designer suitcase half-packed, hurriedly shoving his custom-tailored dress shirts into the bag with frantic, erratic movements. He did not greet me. He did not ask about my day. He simply stopped, let out a long breath, and dropped the bomb that was supposed to destroy my life. He told me he was leaving. He stated flatly that our marriage was no longer working for him. And then, with a twisted combination of guilt and cruel defiance, he confessed that he had been having an affair. I immediately braced myself to hear the name of a random coworker or some stranger he met at a hotel bar during one of his business trips. Instead, he looked me dead in the eyes, his face completely devoid of real remorse, and said it was Monique, my 32-year-old sister, the pampered golden child of our family. The silence that engulfed the foyer felt heavy enough to crush the breath right out of my lungs. For a fraction of a second, the mahogany floor beneath my feet seemed to tilt. This was not just a typical betrayal of marriage vows. This was a profound, catastrophic violation of my own blood. But the hysterical tears Terrence was clearly expecting never materialized. I did not collapse into a sobbing mess against the wall. I did not scream, throw objects, or beg him to explain himself. My initial wave of grief was instantly swallowed by a cold, sharp, and terrifying clarity. Terrence took my total silence as an open invitation to justify his disgusting actions. He started pacing back and forth across the entryway, waving his hands defensively as if he were the actual victim in this scenario. He began to gaslight me right there in my own hallway. He told me that I was never around, that I was married to my financial firm and my high-net-worth clients. He had the absolute audacity to say that my intense focus on my career made him feel small, that my success was intimidating, and that he desperately needed a woman who actually needed him to survive. He lowered his voice, trying to inject a tone of genuine pain into his pathetic excuses. He said that Monique understands him better. He claimed she actually listens to his struggles, that she makes him feel like a real man, unlike me, who supposedly treats him like just another asset to be managed and optimized. He stood there and framed an entire year of calculated betrayal as a tragic, unavoidable mistake driven entirely by my neglect as a wife. He wanted me to believe that my long hours at the office had forced him into the bed of my own younger sister. I stood absolutely still, my face entirely blank, while my analytical mind raced miles ahead of his ridiculous monologue. As a wealth manager, my entire livelihood depends on my ability to find hidden patterns, to track financial discrepancies, and to uncover concealed truths hidden within massive piles of data. Now, in the worst moment of my life, my professional instincts took over completely. I began applying those investigative skills to my own marriage, and suddenly, every confusing detail and minor argument from the past year snapped together with a terrifying, undeniable precision. I did not cry because I was too busy calculating. I thought about the $5,000 that had mysteriously vanished from our joint savings account 8 months ago. At the time, Terrence had sworn to me, looking right into my eyes, that he urgently needed it to help his mother pay off some unexpected medical bills. I had not questioned it or asked for receipts because I trusted my husband. Now, the truth was glaringly obvious. I thought about his sudden, inexplicable surge in out-of-state corporate sales conferences. He had flown to Miami 3 times in the last 6 months alone. My mind immediately jumped to Monique's social media. She had taken 3 extravagant girls' trips to Miami during those exact same weeks, posting photos from luxury beach clubs while claiming her friends were footing the bill. Then, the most damning piece of the puzzle fell into place. Monique was obsessed with maintaining a flawless, wealthy appearance. Her lavish lifestyle was entirely funded by her husband, Greg, a highly successful and generous commercial real estate developer. But at our last family Sunday dinner at my mother's house, Monique had proudly flaunted a brand new limited edition designer handbag. She had loudly bragged to the entire table that Greg had surprised her with it for no reason at all. I vividly remembered watching Greg from across the dining room. A brief look of total confusion had crossed his face when she said it, before he quickly smoothed his expression and politely nodded along, clearly not wanting to cause an embarrassing scene in front of our mother, Brenda. Greg had not bought that expensive bag. Terrence had. Terrence had used the money he systematically stole from my hard-earned savings to finance my sister's insatiable appetite for luxury. The sheer disrespect of it all burned through my veins like acid, but I refused to let him see me sweat. Terrence was still rambling, talking in circles about how he hoped we could be mature adults about this situation, how he deeply hoped it would not tear our extended family apart. He honestly believed he could just pack his expensive clothes, break my heart, and walk away clean, leaving me behind to clean up the emotional wreckage. He was banking heavily on the fact that I had always been the strong one. My mother, Brenda, had spent 35 years actively conditioning me to absorb the family's pain so that Monique could remain comfortable, shielded, and stress-free. Terrence thought I would just swallow this horrific betrayal to keep the family peace, exactly like I had swallowed every other injustice my entire life. He thought I would cry myself to sleep and eventually forgive them both, because that is what the family always expected of Jada. He thought his gaslighting had worked. He thought I was standing there in silence because I was broken. He had absolutely no idea that I was not broken at all. I was simply auditing the destruction of my life, taking inventory of the lies, the stolen funds, and the profound disrespect. He zipped the duffel bag closed, grabbed the handle, and gave me one last look of fake sympathy, completely unaware that his confession was not the end of our story. It was the spark that was about to burn his entire world to the ground. Terrence zipped his duffel bag and offered me a pitiful, condescending smile. He opened his mouth to deliver whatever final rehearsed line he had prepared about finding ourselves and moving on with grace. He truly believed he had orchestrated the perfect exit. He thought he was walking away from a tired, overworked wife and stepping straight into a shiny new life with my glamorous younger sister. But I was already done listening. I reached into the side pocket of my leather tote, my fingers wrapped around the cold, familiar metal of my phone. I unlocked the screen. Terrence paused, his brow furrowing in confusion. He probably thought I was going to call our mother Brenda. That was the established family script, The toxic cycle we had played out for 3 decades. Whenever Monique caused a disaster, you were supposed to call Brenda. Brenda would cry, Brenda would pray, and then Brenda would figure out a way to sweep the entire mess under the rug so the church congregation and the neighbors would not gossip. My mother would inevitably tell me to be the bigger person, to remember that family is family, and to forgive my sister's indiscretions, because Monique had always been so sensitive. But I was not calling Brenda. I scrolled right past my mother's contact information and tapped the name of the one person in this entire equation who had just as much to lose as I did. I called Greg. Greg was 38 years old, a highly successful, wealthy white commercial real estate developer. He adored my sister. He treated Monique like absolute royalty, funding her designer wardrobe, her luxury vacations, and her endless cosmetic treatments. But underneath that doting husband exterior, Greg was a ruthless, brilliant businessman who lived and breathed by data, contracts, and hard facts. He was punctual, analytical, and he respected me because we shared that same cutthroat professional drive. He answered on the second ring. "Hey Jada, everything okay?" I tapped the speaker icon on my screen. The audio filled the quiet foyer of my home. Terrence froze completely. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving an ashy, terrified pallor behind. "Greg," I said, my voice incredibly steady and completely void of any emotion. "I need you to do me a favor right now. Open the security tracking app on your phone, the one linked to the white Mercedes you bought Monique for her birthday." Terrence lunged forward. "Jada, stop! What are you doing?" he hissed, his hands trembling wildly as he reached for my device. I stepped back smoothly out of his reach, keeping the phone raised. I looked at him with absolute disgust, silently daring him to try and grab it again. He dropped his hands, paralyzed by the sheer panic washing over him. "Jada?" Greg asked, his voice tightening with immediate concern. "What is going on? Is Monique hurt? Did something happen to her?" "Monique is perfectly fine," I replied calmly, "but I need you to look at the GPS history for the 3rd week of August. Specifically, I need you to look at the 3 days she told you she was attending that exclusive women's wellness retreat in Sedona. Look at where her car was actually parked during that time." There was absolute silence on the line. I could hear the faint, rapid clicking of a computer keyboard in the background. Greg was clearly at his home office desk. In my foyer, Terrence was practically hyperventilating. The suave, confident, arrogant man from 2 minutes ago had completely vanished. In his place stood a terrified coward who was suddenly realizing his actions had massive, real-world consequences. He had wanted a clean break, but I was dragging him through the broken glass. "Jada, please," Terrence whispered, tears actually pooling in his eyes now. His voice was shaking. "Do not do this. We can handle this privately. Between us. Please do not blow this up." I ignored him entirely. I waited for Greg. "It says the car was parked at the long-term parking lot at the international airport," Greg finally said. His voice had dropped an entire octave. All the previous warmth was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating edge. "Where was my wife, Jada?" I looked dead into Terrence's tear-filled eyes. "She was in Miami, with my husband." Greg did not scream. He did not curse. He did not demand an explanation or accuse me of lying. The silence that followed my statement was incredibly heavy and absolutely lethal. As a man who read financial spreadsheets and contract loopholes for a living, Greg did not need me to spell it out any further. The data matched the reality. "I am on my way over," I told him, and I ended the call before he could say another word. I dropped the phone back into my bag and grabbed my car keys from the console table. Terrence was frantic now. He dropped his expensive duffel bag, the one he had packed so carefully with the clothes I had purchased for him, right there on the hardwood floor. He scrambled after me as I opened the front door and stepped out into the damp, chilly October night. "You are crazy!" Terrence yelled, his voice cracking loudly as he chased me down our front walkway. "You just ruined her life. Greg is going to kill her. He is going to cut her off completely. She does not have a prenuptial agreement that protects her if she cheats, Jada. You know that. I found it incredibly fascinating and deeply pathetic that even now, in the exact moment our 10-year marriage was violently imploding, Terrence's primary concern was Monique's financial security. He was not begging for my forgiveness. He was not apologizing for breaking my heart. He was begging me to protect his mistress's bank account. It proved exactly what I had suspected. They were two leeches who had found each other, perfectly content to drain their respective spouses dry. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob. My car chirped brightly in the driveway. Her life was ruined the second she decided to sleep with her sister's husband, I said, pulling open my car door. I am just delivering the receipt. I slid into the driver's seat, locked the doors instantly, and started the engine. Terrence slammed his hands against my driver's side window, pleading with me, his face distorted in panic. I put the car in reverse and backed out of the driveway without hesitation, forcing him to jump out of the way to avoid being hit. The drive to Greg and Monique's estate took 20 minutes, but it felt like a surreal blur. The nighttime roads were slick from an earlier rainstorm, reflecting the glaring streetlights. Terrence was right behind me the entire way. He had jumped into his own sedan and was aggressively tailgating me. He flashed his high beams frantically, over and over, trying to blind me into pulling over to the shoulder. He laid on his horn, the sound desperate and erratic, echoing through the quiet suburban streets. Looking at his flashing headlights in my rearview mirror, I felt a strange, terrifying sense of peace wash over me. For my entire life, I had played the role of the shock absorber. When Monique wrecked my parents' car at 17, I was the one who emptied my summer job savings to pay for the repairs so my mother would not have a nervous breakdown. When Monique wanted a lavish destination wedding that my parents could not afford, Brenda had emotionally blackmailed me into contributing $20,000 to the event, claiming it was my duty as the older sister to make sure our family looked successful to Greg's wealthy relatives. I had always shrunk myself down. I had always swallowed my pride. I had always written the checks to buy the family peace. Monique thought she could just take my husband and my dignity, and that I would absorb this ultimate blow exactly like I had absorbed every other injustice. She thought she could rely on my silence. But tonight, the bank was officially closed. Tonight, I was not the responsible older sister. I was the architect of their destruction. I turned onto the exclusive private road that led to their neighborhood. The houses here were sprawling mansions, hidden behind massive privacy hedges and wrought iron gates. I approached the entrance to their estate. Usually you had to stop at the brass call box and wait for Monique to buzz you in. But tonight, the massive black iron gates were already swinging inward. Greg had bypassed the security protocol, leaving the gates wide open for my arrival. I drove through, my tires crunching against the pristine gravel of their long, sweeping driveway lined with perfectly manicured oak trees. Terrence's car sped right through the open gates directly behind me, nearly clipping the iron structure in his blind panic. I pulled my car right into the center of the massive circular driveway, throwing it into park. Terrence slammed his brakes violently, his tires screeching loudly against the pavement. He jumped out of his vehicle before it was even fully settled, sprinting toward my car. But he was entirely too late. He froze in his tracks halfway across the driveway. I stepped out of my car and looked toward the house. The massive custom mahogany double front doors of the estate were already wide open. The bright, warm light from the grand foyer spilled out onto the dark front porch. And standing right in the center of that light was Greg. He was holding a tablet in one hand, his posture rigid, looking like a terrifying storm that was just about to break. I walked slowly up the wide stone steps, leaving Terrence standing paralyzed in the driveway behind me. Greg did not move an inch as I approached. He had his tablet gripped so tightly in his right hand that his knuckles were completely white. He was wearing dark dress pants and a crisp white button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking every bit the ruthless executive he was known to be. The grand crystal chandelier in their massive entryway cast a brilliant, unforgiving light over his sharp features. His jaw was clenched so hard, I could practically hear his teeth grinding together. I stopped just before the threshold. Greg looked at me, his eyes dark and entirely hollow. He did not say hello. He just turned the screen of his tablet toward me. It was not just the GPS tracking data from the Mercedes. In the 10 minutes it took me to drive over, Greg had pulled his shared credit card statements, matching the exact dates of the Miami trip to a series of exorbitant charges at luxury boutiques and high-end restaurants. The evidence was irrefutable. We were two incredibly detail-oriented professionals staring at the audited bankruptcy of our respective marriages. Before either of us could speak, the sound of high heels clicking against marble echoed from deep inside the house. "Are you expecting a package at this hour, babe?" Monique called out. Her voice was light, musical, and dripping with the careless entitlement of a woman who had never faced a single consequence in her entire 32 years of life. She rounded the corner into the grand foyer, tying the silk sash of her expensive designer robe. She had a glowing, pampered complexion, her hair perfectly styled even at night. She was smiling as she looked up, but the second her eyes landed on me standing on her front porch, that smile vanished. Then her gaze shifted past my shoulder to the driveway, where Terrence was slowly, fearfully creeping toward the steps. I watched the exact moment my sister realized her perfect, wealthy, heavily funded reality was crashing down. All the color drained from her face, leaving her a sickly, ashen gray. She stopped dead in her tracks, her manicured hand gripping the curved mahogany banister of the sweeping staircase. Greg stepped back into the foyer, leaving the heavy double doors wide open. He looked at the woman he had spoiled and adored for the last 5 years, as if she were a complete stranger. "I pulled the tracking data on the car I bought you," Greg said. His voice was terrifyingly calm. It lacked any trace of the explosive anger Terrence had anticipated. It was the icy, calculated tone of a man terminating a bad investment. "You were not at a wellness retreat in Sedona. You parked at the airport. I also checked the American Express statements. You spent $12,000 on my card in Miami while you were sleeping with your sister's husband." For about 3 seconds, the foyer was dead silent. I could hear the wind rustling through the massive oak trees in the front yard. I waited to see which manipulation tactic my sister would deploy first. I had lived with her for my entire life, so I knew she had an entire arsenal of lies ready to launch. Monique let out a sudden, jagged gasp. Her knees dramatically buckled, and she sank onto the bottom step of the staircase, burying her face in her hands. She began to sob hysterically. It was not a quiet, remorseful cry. It was a loud, theatrical wail designed to pull immediate sympathy from any man in the room. "It was not what you think," Monique cried out, her voice trembling violently as she looked up at Greg with wide, tear-filled eyes. "Greg, please, you have to listen to me. I was in a terrible place mentally. I was so depressed and you were always working. Terrence knew I was vulnerable. He cornered me. He manipulated me into going with him. He told me that Jada was verbally abusive to him and that he just needed someone to talk to. He pressured me, Greg. He would not leave me alone." Out on the front steps, Terrence let out a loud, strangled noise of pure shock. He stepped forward, his eyes bulging out of his head. He could not believe what he was hearing. Just 20 minutes ago in my foyer, Terrence had confidently claimed that he and Monique shared a deep, misunderstood connection. He had thought they were partners in love. Now, he was watching his beloved mistress violently throw him directly under the bus to save her own luxurious lifestyle. "Monique, what are you saying?" Terrence stammered, his voice cracking loudly. "You told me you loved me. You told me you were going to leave him." "Shut up!" Monique screamed at him, her face twisting in absolute hatred. "You ruined my life. You took advantage of me when I was weak. Greg, please, you know how much I love you. I am your wife. You cannot let them do this to us. Jada has always been jealous of me. She is just trying to destroy my happiness because her own marriage is a failure. She actually tried to blame me." Even caught red-handed, with the undeniable financial receipts glowing on the tablet in her husband's hand, My sister instinctively tried to flip the narrative to make me the villain. She expected Greg to swoop in, protect her, and kick me off the property. She expected the golden child shield to work, just like it always worked with our mother, Brenda. But Greg was not Brenda. Greg slowly lowered the tablet. He looked at Monique's tear-streaked face, completely unmoved by her theatrical performance. "You think I am an idiot?" Greg stated softly. "You think because I gave you everything, I am stupid enough to believe that a mid-level sales representative forced you to buy $12,000 worth of luxury bags and five-star dinners on my dime?" Monique scrambled to her feet, reaching her hands out toward him. "Greg, no, please! Do not touch me!" Greg snapped, his voice finally cracking like a whip. The sudden volume made Monique flinch backward. "You are a liar, a thief, and a parasite. You brought this garbage into my life, and you brought it into Jada's life." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his cell phone. He did not hesitate. He dialed a specialized, dedicated number. I knew exactly who he was calling. It was the private concierge line for his elite banking tier. He put the phone on speaker and held it up. A polite representative answered immediately. "This is Greg," he said clearly into the receiver. "I need to report a compromised account. I need you to immediately freeze all secondary cards attached to my primary profile." "Yes, the platinum and the black card issued to Monique. Effective immediately. Lock them down entirely. Decline all pending authorizations." "No!" Monique shrieked, the reality of her situation finally piercing through her delusion. "Greg, you cannot do that. I have nothing. I do not have a separate bank account." "That sounds like a personal problem," Greg replied coldly, before confirming the security block with the agent and hanging up the phone. He pointed a steady finger toward the massive open doorway. "Get out." Monique stared at him in horror. "Greg, it is the middle of the night. Where am I supposed to go? My clothes, my things, I need to pack." "I will have my assistants box up whatever you brought into this marriage and ship it to your mother's house by the end of the week," Greg said, his tone absolute and final. "But you are not spending another second under my roof. Get out of my house right now, or I am calling the police and having you formally removed for trespassing." Monique realized he was entirely serious. The luxurious bubble she had lived in for 5 years had just popped permanently. She turned toward me, her eyes wide and desperate. The arrogance was completely gone. She reverted to the scared younger sister routine, the one that had successfully manipulated me into fixing her problems since we were children. "Jada, please," she sobbed, stumbling toward the doorway. "Please talk to him. You know I am fragile. You know I cannot handle this kind of stress. Let me come home with you tonight. We can figure this out as a family. Tell him to just give me a chance to explain." I looked at the woman who had spent the last year sleeping in my bed, spending my money, and laughing behind my back. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The familial bond she was trying to pull on had been completely severed the moment Terrence confessed. I stepped backward, out of her reach. "You should call an Uber," I told her quietly, "assuming your personal debit card has enough funds to get you back to our mother's house." I turned my back on her and began walking down the steps. Terrence was still standing on the pavement, looking completely lost and devastated. He reached a hand out toward me as I passed him, his mouth opening to say something, but I did not even break my stride. I walked right past him, treating him like an invisible ghost in the night. Behind me, Greg forcefully slammed the heavy double mahogany doors shut. The loud, booming sound echoed across the sprawling driveway, carrying a sense of absolute finality. I heard the heavy deadbolt slide into place. I unlocked my car, got into the driver's seat, and started the engine. As I pulled my car around the circular driveway, my headlights swept across the grand front porch one last time. Monique was collapsed against the heavy wooden doors, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, wearing nothing but a silk robe in the crisp October air. Terrence stood at the bottom of the steps, staring up at her, realizing he had thrown away a dedicated, successful wife for a woman who viewed him as nothing more than a convenient scapegoat. I drove out of the massive iron gates, leaving them both behind in the dark. I did not feel sad. I did not feel broken. As I merged back onto the quiet highway heading toward my home, I felt a profound, exhilarating sense of liberation. The hardest part was over. I had finally stopped protecting the people who were actively destroying me. But I knew this was only the beginning. By tomorrow morning, my mother would hear about this, and the real war for my family's narrative was about to begin. I barely slept that night, but I did not shed a single tear. I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of black coffee, watching the sun rise over the manicured lawns of my quiet neighborhood. The house felt entirely different without Terrence's heavy footsteps or his passive-aggressive complaints about my work schedule. It felt clean. It felt like mine. I was just beginning to process the massive shift in my reality when the aggressive pounding started at my front door. It was exactly 7 in the morning. It was not a polite, hesitant knock. It was the frantic, demanding banging of a woman who believed the world revolved entirely around her schedule. I set my coffee mug down, walked through the foyer where Terrence had dropped his duffel bag the night before, and pulled open the heavy front door. My mother, Brenda, stood on my porch. She was fully dressed in her Sunday church suit, complete with a perfectly pinned hat, looking as though she was ready to address a congregation. Standing slightly behind her, wearing oversized dark sunglasses and the same wrinkled designer silk robe from the night before, was Monique. My sister looked like a deflated balloon, clutching a small leather overnight bag to her chest. My mother did not greet me. She did not wrap her arms around me. She did not look into my eyes to ask how I was holding up after discovering that my husband of a decade had been sleeping with my own sister. Instead, she pushed past me, grabbed Monique by the wrist, and dragged her into my house. "Close the door, Jada," my mother snapped, marching straight into my formal living room. "The neighbors do not need to see our family business displayed on the front lawn." I closed the door slowly, leaning against the frame as I watched them invade my sanctuary. Monique immediately collapsed onto my custom white sofa, pulling her knees up to her chest and letting out a pathetic, practiced whimper. My mother dropped her leather handbag onto the coffee table and turned to face me. She took a deep breath, smoothing down the front of her tailored jacket, instantly shifting into the role of the family crisis manager. "I have been up all night dealing with this mess," Brenda began, her voice dripping with severe irritation. "Terrence called me at 3 in the morning crying like a child, and Monique had to take an expensive luxury cab all the way to my house because Greg locked her out. Now, here is what we are going to do to fix this disaster before it ruins everything." I crossed my arms over my chest and stared at her, genuinely amazed by her audacity. "Fix it?" I asked quietly. "Yes, fix it," Brenda demanded, her tone hardening. "I need you to get your phone right now and call Greg. You are going to tell him that you made a terrible mistake. You are going to say that the GPS tracking was a massive misunderstanding, that Terrence was simply giving Monique a ride from the airport because her car broke down. You are going to tell him that you were severely stressed from your demanding job, and that you completely overreacted and projected your marital insecurities onto your sister." The sheer magnitude of the lie she was proposing hung in the air like a thick, toxic smog. My mother was standing in my home, looking at her betrayed, exhausted oldest daughter, and ordering me to perjure my own sanity to save her favorite child's bank account. I looked from Brenda to Monique, who was peeking out from behind her dark sunglasses, waiting for me to comply just like I always did. "You want me to lie to Greg?" I stated flatly, ensuring I heard her correctly. "You want me to take the blame for their year-long affair?" Brenda let out an exasperated sigh, throwing her hands up as if I were a stubborn toddler, refusing to eat my vegetables. "Jada, be reasonable. Do you have any idea what is at stake here? Greg is going to divorce her. He froze her credit cards. She has absolutely no money of her own. She cannot afford to live on her own, and she certainly cannot maintain her lifestyle. You are strong, Jada. You have always been so tough and resilient. But Monique is fragile. She cannot survive a public scandal or a brutal divorce like you can. You have your career, your firm, your money. You will land on your feet. She will lose everything." That single word echoed violently in my head. Fragile. I stared at my mother, and suddenly, I was not 35 years old anymore. I was 18 years old again, standing in the cramped kitchen of my childhood home, holding a bank statement in my shaking hands. I had worked double shifts at a diner for 3 straight years during high school, saving every single dollar I earned to pay for my community college tuition. But when I went to withdraw the funds to pay for my first semester, the account was completely empty. My mother, who was a joint signer on the account, had drained all $12,000 of my hard-earned savings. When I had confronted her back then, crying and devastated, she had given me the exact same speech she was giving me right now. She had told me that Monique desperately needed the money for her lavish 300-guest dream wedding. She had said, "Jada, you are so smart and capable, you can easily get academic scholarships and take out student loans. But Monique is fragile. She needs this beautiful day to feel secure in her new life. You have to sacrifice for your sister." I had swallowed my tears that day. I had taken on massive student debt. I had worked myself to the bone while my sister drank champagne under a massive ice sculpture paid for with my blood and sweat. For 35 years, my mother had used my strength as a weapon against me, penalizing my independence to subsidize my sister's parasitic existence. Not today. The cycle was officially broken. I dropped my arms to my sides and took a step toward my mother. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "No," I said. The single syllable was so sharp, so absolute, that Brenda actually blinked in shock. "Excuse me?" she demanded, her voice rising in disbelief. "I said no," I repeated, my voice deadly calm. "I am not calling Greg. I am not lying for her. I am not covering up the fact that my husband and my sister have been sleeping together in expensive hotel rooms paid for with money stolen from my savings. Monique is not fragile, Mother. She is a calculating, selfish coward who finally got caught, and for the first time in her pampered life, she is going to face the consequences of her own horrific choices." Monique let out a loud, dramatic sob and buried her face in the sofa cushions. "Mom! Make her do it!" she wailed, playing her part to perfection. "She is trying to ruin my life because she is jealous of me." Brenda's face flushed with a dark, terrifying rage. The polished church lady facade completely shattered, revealing the viciously controlling matriarch underneath. She marched right up to me, pointing a manicured finger directly in my face. "Listen to me, you ungrateful girl," Brenda snarled, her voice echoing off the high ceilings of my living room. "I am your mother, and I am telling you to fix this. If you do not pick up that phone right now, I will personally see to it that you are completely cut off from this family. The family reunion gala is next month, and I will ban you from attending. I will tell the entire church congregation that you drove your husband away with your cold, obsessive career ambitions, and that you maliciously framed your own sister out of pure spite. You will have no one, Jada. Do you hear me? No one!" She thought the threat of isolation would break me. She thought that losing the family's approval was my greatest fear. She did not realize that over the last 12 hours, I had discovered that their approval was entirely worthless. I looked at her pointing finger, and then I looked directly into her furious eyes. I smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the cold, terrifying smile of a woman who had just been handed the keys to her own prison cell. "You can tell your congregation whatever you want," I replied softly. "You can have the gala, you can keep your golden child. But you cannot keep my money, and you cannot dictate my reality ever again." I walked over to the front door and pulled it wide open, letting the crisp morning air flood into the suffocating house. "Get out of my house," I commanded. "Both of you, right now." Brenda stood frozen, completely bewildered by my absolute refusal to submit. She opened her mouth to scream another threat, but she saw the unyielding steel in my expression and realized she had entirely lost control of her designated scapegoat. She snatched her purse off the coffee table. "Get up, Monique," Brenda snapped bitterly. "We are leaving." She has clearly lost her mind. Monique scrambled off my couch, avoiding my gaze entirely as she scurried out the front door like a frightened rat. Brenda followed her, stopping on the threshold to give me one last look of absolute disgust. "You are going to deeply regret this, Jada," my mother warned, her voice trembling with fury. "I am already regretting the last 35 years," I replied, and I slammed the heavy wooden door forcefully in her face. The deadbolt clicked into place with a satisfying heavy sound. I stood in my quiet foyer, the adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The toxic family shield had just been deployed against me, but it had shattered on impact. I had survived the first wave of their attack. Now, it was time to clean house. I walked directly past the foyer table, grabbed a box of heavy-duty black trash bags from the kitchen pantry, and headed straight for the primary bedroom. Terrence had left half of his belongings behind in his panic last night, and I had absolutely no intention of looking at them for another second. But as I prepared to throw his expensive suits into the garbage, I had no idea that my financial nightmare was only just beginning. I stood in the center of our primary bedroom, the heavy roll of industrial black trash bags weighing down my hand. For a decade, I had shared this intimate space with a man who ultimately viewed me as nothing more than a convenient ATM. I ripped the first bag from the roll and snapped it open with a sharp, echoing crack. I walked straight into his massive walk-in closet. Terrence loved to play the part of the highly successful corporate executive, even though my income dwarfed his by a staggering margin. I grabbed his custom-tailored Italian suits off their velvet hangers and shoved them unceremoniously into the plastic. I did not fold them. I did not care about the delicate fabrics. Next came the rows of expensive leather dress shoes, the imported silk ties, and the designer watches I had purchased for his past 3 birthdays. Every single luxury item that he had acquired through my hard work went straight into the garbage. I filled 6 massive bags in less than 20 minutes. I dragged them one by one down the carpeted hallway, across the hardwood floor of the foyer and out the front door. The morning dew was still fresh on the manicured lawn as I hauled the heavy bags down the driveway and hurled them onto the curb next to the municipal trash bins. I wanted the entire neighborhood to see the physical manifestation of his eviction. I wanted him to drive past the house and see his overpriced, pretentious wardrobe treated exactly like the trash it was. Returning inside, I locked the front door, engaged the deadbolt, and headed straight for my home office. Throwing out his clothes was therapeutic, but it was purely symbolic. The real battle ahead of me was financial. As a senior wealth manager, I spend my days protecting high-net-worth clients from market volatility, bad investments, and predatory relatives. Now, I had to apply every single ounce of my professional expertise to protect myself from my own husband. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk, woke up my triple monitor display, and logged into my firm's highly encrypted server. I bypassed the standard employee portal and accessed my personal portfolio dashboards. The $5,000 he had stolen from our joint savings account to fund his Miami trips with Monique was a drop in the bucket compared to the assets I actually possessed. When Terrence and I got married 10 years ago, I had insisted on keeping my primary investment accounts and the deed to this house completely separate. I had placed everything of significant value into an ironclad trust. Terrence had mocked me for it back then, accusing me of withholding my trust and not fully committing to our marriage. Now, that legal structure was the only thing standing between him and my life's work. I initiated a comprehensive total lockdown of my entire financial footprint. I changed every single password using randomly generated cryptographic strings. I revoked his authorized user status on all our secondary credit cards. I transferred the remaining balance of our joint checking account directly into an escrow account, leaving exactly $1 behind. Then, I placed maximum security fraud alerts on my social security number with all 3 major credit bureaus. Once the perimeter was secure, I began a deep forensic audit of my accounts. I meticulously combed through every transaction, every wire transfer, and every credit inquiry from the past 12 months. I was looking for patterns, searching for any other hidden bleed in my finances. That is when I saw it. An anomaly. A flashing red notification popped up on my dashboard from a third-party lending institution that I had never done business with in my life. It was a hard inquiry on my credit report, dated just 4 days ago. My heart rate instantly spiked. I clicked on the notification, bypassing the initial summary screen and diving straight into the raw data. It was a pending application for a high-yield collateralized personal loan. The requested payout amount was $200,000. I stared at the screen, my blood running completely cold. The loan application was explicitly attempting to use my pre-marital investment portfolio as the primary collateral to secure the cash. Because the portfolio was tied directly to my name and my social security number, the application required the primary account holder's legal authorization. I clicked the hyperlink to view the submitted digital documents. A large PDF loaded on my right monitor. It was a standard financial authorization form, filled out with Terrence's personal email and cell phone number, but listing me as the primary guarantor. I scrolled down past the terms and conditions to the bottom of the last page. Right there, on the digital signature line, was my name. It was an electronic signature, but it was accompanied by a scanned copy of my actual state-issued driver license and a digitized stamp of my physical signature. I immediately looked across the room at my heavy steel filing cabinet. I always kept it locked, but the key was hidden in a small ceramic bowl on the bookshelf. Terrence knew exactly where that key was. He had waited until I was exhausted from work, accessed my secure home office, gone into my locked cabinet, and copied my identification to forge my signature on a massive federal loan document. The sheer audacity of his crime left me breathless. I leaned back in my leather chair, the reality of the situation washing over me in waves of absolute disgust. This was not a panicked mistake made by a confused husband. This was a highly calculated, premeditated act of absolute financial warfare. Terrence knew he was going to leave me for Monique. He also knew that because of my airtight trust, he would not be able to touch the bulk of my wealth in a standard, drawn-out divorce settlement. So, he had decided to rob me blind before he even packed his bags. He was trying to secure $200,000 in liquid cash, leaving me entirely responsible for the massive debt, so he and my sister could start their new romantic life together with a heavily funded safety net. He had planned to execute a perfect extraction. He wanted to leave me heartbroken over the affair, alienated by my mother, and financially crippled by a fraudulent loan. I felt a dangerous, icy calm settle over my entire body. The sadness and the shock of the affair completely evaporated, replaced by a razor-sharp, predatory focus. Terrence thought he was so incredibly smart. He thought his smooth corporate sales charm could outwit a woman who analyzed complex market trends and moved millions of dollars a day before breakfast. By attempting to forge my signature on a loan application, he had crossed a massive, irreversible line. He was no longer just a cheating husband. He was a federal criminal who had just committed wire fraud and identity theft across state lines. He had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to completely destroy him. I picked up my phone and dialed the elite fraud department of the lending institution directly. I did not just cancel the loan application. I formally reported it as a felony identity theft in progress. I provided my wealth management credentials, verifying my identity through a secure two-factor authentication protocol with the bank's security manager. I demanded they freeze the application indefinitely. I ordered them to compile all digital IP addresses, geographical timestamp data, and uploaded document metadata, and forward everything directly to my secure email server for an impending criminal investigation. The bank manager, realizing the severity of the situation and the liability they were facing, complied immediately. I printed the forged documents, the credit inquiries, and the IP tracking data. The printer hummed quietly in the corner of the room, spitting out page after page of undeniable proof of his crimes. I gathered the warm sheets of paper and slipped them into a thick red legal folder. The emotional betrayal of the affair was deeply painful, but this financial betrayal required a completely different level of vengeance. I was no longer just preparing for a messy divorce. I was preparing for an absolute total slaughter. I knew exactly what Terrence would do next. The moment he realized his access to my money was cut off and his fraudulent loan was frozen, he would panic. He would go on the offensive to try and intimidate me into backing down. He would hire the most aggressive lawyer he could find, completely unaware that I was already holding all the cards. Exactly 48 hours after I threw his designer wardrobe onto the curb, Terrence realized the absolute severity of his situation. He had undoubtedly marched into his local bank branch, expecting to find the $200,000 fraudulent loan securely deposited into his private checking account. He had probably planned to use that stolen cash to secure a luxury apartment for himself and my sister. Instead, he was met with frozen joint accounts, a locked credit profile, and the terrifying realization that his entire financial life support system had been completely unplugged. I had cut him off so thoroughly that he did not even have access to the funds required to pay his own cell phone bill. His reaction to being stripped of my wealth was as predictable as it was pathetic. He decided to go on the offensive. I was sitting in my corner office on the 40th floor of my wealth management firm, reviewing a quarterly prospectus for one of my highest net worth clients. My glass walls offered a panoramic view of the downtown skyline, a daily reminder of the empire I had built through my own sheer determination and intellect. My intercom buzzed softly. My executive assistant informed me that a courier was waiting at the reception desk and absolutely insisted on delivering a package directly to me, requiring my physical signature. I knew immediately what it was. Terrence was trying to humiliate me. By sending a process server to my prestigious corporate workplace, he was hoping to cause a public spectacle in front of my colleagues and my staff. He wanted me to feel embarrassed and ashamed, assuming I would quickly agree to whatever terms he demanded, just to make the scandal quietly disappear. I told my assistant to send the man back to my office. A tall, serious-looking man in a cheap gray suit walked through my glass doors and handed me a thick manila envelope. I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact. I politely took the envelope, signed his clipboard with my favorite heavy fountain pen, and wished him a wonderful afternoon. The process server actually looked disappointed that I had not burst into tears or caused a dramatic scene. Once my office door clicked shut, leaving me completely alone in the quiet luxury of my workspace, I sat back down in my leather chair and tore open the seal. The document inside was a formal petition for divorce, and reading it was like reading a work of pure, delusional fiction. Terrence had not just hired any lawyer, he had retained Vincent Caldwell, a notoriously aggressive, predatory divorce attorney who specialized in representing the disgruntled, lower-earning spouses of highly successful executives. Caldwell was famous in the city for dragging out divorce proceedings for years, leveraging public embarrassment and nasty smear campaigns to shake down wealthy partners for massive cash settlements. Terrence had found the perfect legal bully to execute his extortion attempt. The demands outlined in the petition were absolutely staggering. Terrence was formally requesting permanent spousal support to the tune of $15,000 a month. He claimed that because he had grown accustomed to the luxurious lifestyle I provided, he was legally entitled to maintain that exact same standard of living post-divorce. But the absolute worst part was the narrative his lawyer had crafted in the legal brief. Terrence had the unmitigated audacity to claim that he had sacrificed his own professional advancement to support my early career. The document stated that he was the foundational rock of our marriage, that he had managed the household and provided critical emotional support while I selfishly pursued my corporate ambitions. He argued that my wealth was a direct result of his invisible labor behind the scenes, and therefore he was demanding 50% of all my financial assets, including the investments securely locked inside my premarital trust. I read the words twice, letting the sheer disrespect wash over me. When I was studying late into the night for my grueling Series 7 financial exams, Terrence was out drinking heavily with his college fraternity brothers. When I was working consecutive 80-hour weeks to secure my promotion to senior wealth manager, Terrence was conveniently calling in sick to his mediocre sales job so he could play video games on my expensive television. I had bought his cars. I had paid off his outstanding credit card debt before our wedding. I had funded his entire existence. And now, the man who had spent the last year sleeping with my younger sister was demanding half of my life's work as a reward for his betrayal. A weaker woman might have panicked. A woman who did not understand the intricate mechanisms of the legal and financial systems might have picked up the phone, called her mother crying, and begged to negotiate a settlement just to make the nightmares stop. Terrence and his predatory lawyer were banking entirely on my fear. They thought the threat of a prolonged, messy, and public court battle would force me to open my checkbook. They had severely underestimated who they were dealing with. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, calculating, and absolute rage. I picked up my desk phone and instructed my assistant to hold all my calls and cancel my remaining afternoon meetings. I locked my office door. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking down at the tiny cars moving through the city streets below. Terrence wanted to play a game of financial warfare. He wanted to use the legal system to bully me into handing over my money. But he had completely forgotten that money was my ultimate domain. I lived, breathed, and manipulated capital every single day. I returned to my workstation and launched my secure forensic software suite. Usually, I use these elite financial tools to protect my clients from corporate embezzlement or to audit massive commercial acquisitions. Today, I was turning the full power of my analytical expertise directly onto my soon-to-be ex-husband. Since we were still legally married, I had completely lawful access to his historical W-2 tax forms, his past joint account statements, and his credit reports. But I was not just looking at the surface-level data. I was going deep into the digital architecture of his financial footprint. I began by pulling his entire transaction history from the last 3 years. I did not just look at where his paycheck was deposited. I looked at where every single dollar flowed after it hit his account. I set up a massive algorithmic spreadsheet on my primary monitor, cross-referencing his declared corporate income against his known monthly expenditures. The math immediately refused to add up. Terrence was a mid-level sales representative. He made a decent base salary, but his commission checks had always been erratic and unpredictable. Yet, as I traced the digital flow of his money over the last 36 months, I noticed a very strange, consistent pattern. Every time he closed a deal and received a quarterly commission bonus from his company, that money never stayed in his primary checking account for more than 48 hours. It was immediately withdrawn as a cashier's check or wired to an external, unlisted routing number. I dug deeper, my fingers flying across the keyboard. I pulled the IP addresses from his banking login history, cross-referencing the geographical locations with his out-of-state business trips. I pulled the merchant category codes for every single purchase he had made on his personal credit cards, specifically isolating the transactions that occurred during the weeks he claimed he was traveling for work. The picture that began to form on my screens was breathtakingly sinister. Terrence was not just a cheating husband who had foolishly spent a few $1,000s on luxury bags for my sister. He was actively moving substantial amounts of capital entirely off the grid. For 3 years, he had been systematically siphoning his own income, hiding it from me, and depositing it into an invisible secondary financial ecosystem. I leaned closer to my monitors, my eyes scanning line after line of encrypted bank routing data. My mind raced, connecting the disconnected dots. If Terrence was hiding all of his commission money, how was he affording the lavish Miami trips and the expensive designer gifts for Monique? The $5,000 he stole from our joint savings account explained some of it. but it was nowhere near enough to cover the massive luxury expenditures Greg had shown me on his tablet. The math was fundamentally broken. There was a massive hole in the ledger, which meant there was another source of income funding their secret lifestyle. I switched tactics. I stopped looking at his bank accounts and started looking at his public civil records. I ran his name, his social security number, and his middle name through a secure federal corporate registry database. I searched for any registered business licenses, property deeds, or commercial entities tied to his identity in the state. For 10 minutes, the search query ran, combing through millions of public documents. The office was dead silent, save for the quiet hum of my computer processor. Then, a single hit appeared on my screen. It was a document filed with the State Department of Revenue exactly 18 months ago. It was an incorporation certificate for a private limited liability company. The company name was completely generic, designed to blend into the background of thousands of other shell corporations. But the registered agent listed on the document was Terrence, and the secondary officer listed right below his name was Monique. I had found the financial artery. I had found the exact mechanism they were using to hide their stolen money. As I clicked on the linked commercial banking profiles associated with that secret shell company, I realized that Terrence's predatory divorce lawyer was about to be the least of his problems. I was no longer just fighting a greedy husband. I was unraveling a massive, calculated embezzlement ring, and the money trail was about to lead me straight into the darkest, most destructive secrets my family had ever kept. I stared at the state registry documents glowing brightly on my high-resolution monitor. The shell company was registered under the name Desmond Consulting. Desmond was Terrence's middle name. It was an incredibly arrogant and sloppy choice, but criminals rarely think they will ever be caught by the people they underestimate. The registered business address was not a real commercial office. It was a cheap postal box located in a strip mall 3 towns over, intentionally placed entirely outside of our normal daily driving routes. I opened a new, highly encrypted window on my terminal and utilized my elite corporate software to run a full asset trace on the company's routing numbers. What I found in that digital ledger made the air in my office feel incredibly thin. The sheer scale of the betrayal was breathtaking. Terrence had not just been siphoning his quarterly commission checks from his mid-level sales job. He had been quietly withdrawing money from my secondary brokerage accounts, the ones he knew I only checked on an annual basis. He had utilized small, incremental wire transfers that fell just below the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. He was structuring the deposits, which is a classic, textbook money laundering technique designed to avoid triggering automatic bank security flags. The stolen money flowed smoothly into Desmond Consulting, mixed perfectly with his hidden corporate bonuses, and then vanished into a primary corporate checking account that I could not immediately access. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a temporary lapse in judgment fueled by a momentary attraction. This was a long-term, highly calculated financial extraction. Terrence and my sister were actively draining my hard-earned resources to quietly build their own independent empire. But I needed the rest of the puzzle to see the complete picture. I knew my own financial ledgers perfectly, but Monique was officially listed as the secondary executive officer on this fraudulent limited liability company. My sister did not work. She had not held a legitimate job since she dropped out of a basic graphic design program 7 years ago, claiming the classes were too stressful for her mental health. Her entire luxurious existence was funded exclusively by Greg's highly successful commercial real estate empire. If Terrence and Monique were funneling massive amounts of money through this shell company, there was a very high probability that Terrence was not the only one actively stealing. I picked up my cell phone and dialed Greg's private secure number. He answered on the very first ring. His voice sounded like cracked glass, completely exhausted, but entirely devoid of any residual warmth. I told him I had found something massive, something that went far beyond cheap hotel rooms and stolen designer handbags. I gave him the address of an upscale, discreet coffee shop located deep inside the financial district, miles away from our sprawling suburban neighborhoods where my mother's nosy church friends might spot us sitting together. When I walked into the dimly lit cafe an hour later, the smell of roasted espresso beans and rain hit me. Greg was already sitting in a heavy leather booth tucked away in the far back corner, completely hidden from the main street windows. He wore a dark tailored suit, but his silk tie was pulled loose, and the sharp, handsome lines of his face looked incredibly tight with suppressed rage. On the solid wooden table in front of him sat a thick, heavy leather briefcase. I slid into the booth across from him and ordered a black coffee from the waitress. We did not exchange fake pleasantries. We did not ask how the other was holding up. We were two deeply betrayed, highly analytical professionals, operating purely on a shared desire for absolute devastation. I opened my laptop, turned the screen slightly so the glowing display faced him, and pulled up the certified state incorporation documents for Desmond Consulting. I pointed directly to the names legally listed on the certificate: Terrence and Monique. Greg stared at my sister's name on the screen, his jaw clenching so hard a visible muscle feathered rapidly near his temple. I carefully explained the structured bank deposits. I showed him exactly how Terrence had been systematically siphoning my protected brokerage accounts and his own sales income into this central banking hub. Then, I looked Greg dead in the eyes and asked him the million-dollar question. I asked if Monique had any level of access to his commercial business accounts. Greg shook his head firmly at first. He stated that his corporate finances were strictly managed by his dedicated accounting department and that Monique barely knew how to balance a standard checkbook. But then he paused. His eyes darkened significantly as a sudden, sickening realization washed over his face. He unlatched the heavy brass locks on his briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of bound corporate ledgers. His hands were remarkably steady as he flipped through the heavy pages. He explained to me that about 2 years ago, Monique had thrown a massive crying fit about wanting to feel like a contributing equal partner in his life. She had complained that she felt useless just sitting around their mansion all day. To appease her and to keep the peace, Greg had given her a phantom operational role as a creative director for his real estate staging department. The position came complete with a corporate expense account and the administrative authority to approve digital vendor invoices for independent interior design services. Greg flipped open his master ledger, his finger tracing rapidly down a long, detailed list of authorized vendor payouts from the last 24 months. He stopped abruptly at a recurring massive line item. It was a monthly payment categorized for high-end staging furniture and elite consulting fees. The vendor receiving the money was listed simply as DC Incorporated. We looked at each other across the small table, the horrifying truth settling over us like a heavy lead blanket. DC Incorporated. Desmond Consulting. Greg quickly pulled out his tablet and logged directly into his corporate banking portal, completely bypassing the standard security checks with his executive credentials. He pulled the exact routing and transit account numbers for the approved vendor payouts. I typed those exact numbers into my laptop, cross-referencing them with the receiving accounts listed on the limited liability company documents I had just uncovered. It was a perfect, devastating match. Monique had not just been buying luxury items with stolen cash. My sister, the woman my mother constantly defended as being too fragile and delicate for the real world, had been generating fraudulent vendor invoices through Greg's commercial real estate company. She had been authorizing the massive payments herself, successfully wiring huge sums of corporate capital directly into the secret shell account she managed with my husband. Every single time Greg thought he was paying a legitimate interior design firm to perfectly stage his luxury commercial properties, he was actually depositing tens of thousands of dollars straight into his own wife's secret affair fund. Greg leaned back against the tufted leather booth, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh that sounded incredibly dangerous. He ran a hand forcefully over his face. The sheer magnitude of the theft was astronomical. We spent the next 2 hours completely ignoring our cold drinks, painstakingly highlighting and matching the specific dates of the fraudulent vendor payouts to the corresponding deposits in the shell company's account. We tracked every single stolen dollar. By the time we reached the final page of the ledger, we had tallied the final, sickening number. Terrence and Monique had successfully embezzled over $300,000 from Greg's corporate accounts alone, entirely separate from the money Terrence had stolen from my personal portfolios. They did not just break our marriage vows, they had committed coordinated, high-level federal wire fraud. Because they had utilized the Postal Service and electronic banking networks to execute these massive transfers across state lines, they were no longer just facing aggressive divorce attorneys. They were facing serious, mandatory, federal prison sentences. Greg closed his heavy corporate ledger with a loud, definitive snap that echoed sharply in the quiet corner of the cafe. The devastated, heartbroken husband who had stood on his front porch 2 days ago was completely gone. In his place sat a ruthless chief executive officer who had just discovered a massive corporate theft and was preparing to entirely liquidate the responsible parties. We sat in that quiet booth and formalized our alliance. We were not going to settle for a simple divorce settlement. We were not going to let them walk away with a minor slap on the wrist. We were going to compile every single piece of this financial evidence into an airtight federal case. We mapped out our exact next steps, completely unaware that while we were building their legal coffin, Monique was currently preparing to drop a massive public lie that would force us to accelerate our timeline. Greg and I sat in that dimly lit booth, surrounded by cold coffee and the devastating reality of our shattered marriages. We had established the exact amount of money they had stolen, but as a wealth manager, I knew that locating the missing capital was only half the battle. We needed to know exactly where that $300,000 had been parked. Criminals who structure deposits and utilize shell companies rarely leave that kind of cash sitting in a liquid checking account. They convert it into tangible assets. I shifted my laptop closer to the center of the table and began running a comprehensive property search under the Desmond Consulting Limited Liability Company name. I bypassed the standard county assessor portals and logged directly into a premium municipal database that tracks commercial and residential deeds the moment they clear escrow. The search algorithm took less than 30 seconds to return a massive hit. I turned the screen so Greg could see the digital deed. Desmond Consulting had recently closed on a premium residential property. It was not a modest suburban house. It was a sprawling, 3-bedroom luxury condominium located on the 25th floor of a highly exclusive high-rise building right in the center of the downtown arts district. I pulled up the public real estate listing for the specific unit number. The photographs displayed floor-to-ceiling windows, custom marble countertops, a private rooftop terrace, and a massive soaking tub overlooking the city skyline. I looked at the final purchase price listed on the deed. It was exactly $340,000. And right next to the purchase price was the most damning detail of all. There was no mortgage attached to the property. It was a complete all-cash transaction. The entire master plan snapped into crystal-clear focus. Terrence and Monique had not just been stealing money to fund a few lavish vacations or buy expensive clothes. They were actively building their post-divorce nest egg. They had systematically drained my personal portfolios and Greg's commercial accounts to purchase their dream home outright in cash. Their endgame was absolutely brilliant in its sheer cruelty. Terrence was going to bleed me dry in divorce court with his predatory lawyer, demanding alimony and half of my remaining assets. Meanwhile, Monique was going to play the devastated, helpless wife, taking half of Greg's real estate fortune in their inevitable split. Once the dust settled and the legal paperwork was signed, they would miraculously find each other, merge their stolen fortunes, and move into their fully paid luxury penthouse without a single financial care in the world. They thought they had committed the perfect crime. They thought we were too busy working to notice the money quietly slipping out the back door. Greg stared at the pictures of the luxury condominium, his eyes dark and entirely unreadable. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out his phone, and dialed his lead corporate attorney. He did not ask for a consultation. He issued direct, absolute orders. He instructed his legal team to immediately draft a massive civil lawsuit against Desmond Consulting, naming both Terrence and Monique as primary defendants for corporate fraud and embezzlement. He also ordered his lawyers to file an emergency injunction to freeze the condominium asset, ensuring they could not panic and quickly sell the property to liquidate the cash. I listened to Greg orchestrate his legal attack, and I mirrored his energy completely. I texted my own legal team, instructing them to attach the identity theft and forged loan documents to my divorce countersuit. We were not going to play defense. We were building a massive, inescapable federal trap. Between the forged documents, the wire fraud across state lines, and the blatant corporate embezzlement, Terrence and Monique were not just looking at losing a civil case. They were looking at mandatory minimum sentencing in a federal penitentiary. We spent another hour at the coffee shop, meticulously printing digital copies of the deeds, the shell company registrations, and the corporate vendor payouts using a portable encrypted drive I carried in my work bag. We organized the evidence into two identical heavy legal binders, one for Greg's corporate attorneys and one for me. We agreed to keep our communications strictly limited to encrypted channels moving forward. We could not afford a single leak. Terrence and Monique needed to remain completely confident in their delusion until the absolute last second. Greg stood up from the booth, his heavy leather briefcase secured firmly in his hand. He looked down at me, the shared trauma of our betrayal forming an unspoken, unbreakable respect between us. He told me to be careful, warning me that cornered animals often do incredibly unpredictable things. I assured him that I was not afraid of my husband or my sister. I was simply ready to end them. We walked out of the coffee shop and parted ways in the parking garage. I got into my car, the heavy legal binder sitting securely on the passenger seat next to my purse. My next stop was the downtown police precinct. I needed to formally file the identity theft report regarding the forged $200,000 loan application. Submitting that police report was the final trigger required to permanently lock down my credit profile and officially launch the criminal investigation into Terrence. I put my car in drive and pulled out of the parking structure, navigating through the busy afternoon city traffic. The sky had cleared, and the bright sunlight reflected off the glass buildings around me. For the first time in 10 years, I felt entirely free of the invisible heavy burden I had carried as the family problem solver. I was no longer the reliable scapegoat. I was a weapon. I pulled into the visitor parking lot of the police precinct, threw my car into park, and unbuckled my seatbelt. I reached over to grab the heavy legal binder. I was completely ready to walk through those glass double doors and burn my sister and my husband to the ground. Just as my fingers brushed the leather handle of my bag, my cell phone erupted. It was not a normal phone call or a standard text message alert. It was a rapid, aggressive succession of loud notifications. My phone buzzed wildly, shaking against the center console. Buzz after buzz, an absolute avalanche of immediate activity. I picked up the device and looked at the locked screen. The notifications were flooding in from our massive family group chat. My mother, Brenda, had created the group years ago, appropriately naming it the Blessed Family Network. It included over 40 people. Aunts, uncles, older cousins, and several prominent elders from our church congregation were all active members in the chat. Usually, the group was reserved for sharing Sunday service times, holiday dinner recipes, and passive-aggressive prayer requests. I swiped to unlock my screen and opened the messaging application. What I saw instantly froze the blood in my veins. My hand hovered completely motionless over the steering wheel. Monique had just sent a massive, multi-paragraph message to the entire extended family and church congregation. Attached directly above the long block of text was a high-resolution photograph. It was a medical ultrasound image, clearly displaying the tiny, unmistakable outline of a fetus. I read the first sentence of my sister's message, and the air completely left my lungs. She wrote that God works in incredibly mysterious ways, and that out of deep pain and family misunderstanding, A beautiful new blessing was emerging. She announced to our entire bloodline and our religious community that she was 12 weeks pregnant. She claimed the child belonged to Terrence, but she did not stop at the pregnancy announcement. She weaponized it. In the very next paragraph, she painted a horrifying, completely fabricated picture of our marriage. She told our aunts, uncles, and church elders that Terrence had been suffering in silence for years under my cold, abusive, and barren control. She explicitly stated that I was a bitter, career-obsessed woman who had intentionally denied Terrence the opportunity to become a father, and that they had found solace in each other during a time of immense spiritual darkness. She officially branded me as the jealous villain, actively trying to destroy the beautiful family they were destined to build. My phone continued to vibrate frantically in my hand as the replies began pouring in from our relatives. Congratulations, prayer hands, and words of praise flooded the screen, instantly validating her horrific lies. I sat entirely alone in the police station parking lot, staring at the ultrasound picture, realizing that the war had just escalated to a level I had never anticipated. I sat frozen in the driver's seat of my car, the bright afternoon sun suddenly feeling completely cold. My phone screen remained illuminated, displaying the ultrasound image my sister had just blasted to over 40 of our closest relatives and church leaders. I forced my eyes to read the rest of her sickening message. Monique did not just announce a pregnancy. She delivered a calculated, public character assassination disguised as a spiritual testimony. She wrote that Terrence had spent the last 10 years drowning in my cold corporate shadow. She claimed that I cared more about my investment portfolios than I did about building a family, and that my selfish refusal to give him a child had deeply broken his spirit. She actually used the phrase bitter, barren wife to describe me. She told the congregation that God had recognized Terrence's pure heart and had chosen her to correct my failures. She positioned herself as a brave martyr who had simply answered a divine calling to provide this man with the family he was destined to have. The sheer level of manipulation was staggering. Terrence and I had never struggled with infertility. I had simply refused to bring a child into a marriage with a man who could not even manage his own credit card debt. My financial prudence was now being weaponized as a biological defect. But what truly turned my stomach was not Monique's lie. It was the immediate, overwhelming validation she received from the very people who had watched me sacrifice everything for this family. The notifications poured in like a landslide. Aunt Shirley sent a row of praying hands, writing that God truly does work in mysterious ways and brings light out of the darkest situations. Deacon Miller from our church commented that every new life is a precious gift that washes away the sins of the past. Nobody questioned the fact that my sister had been sleeping with my husband. Nobody mentioned the betrayal, the lies, or the sheer devastation of my marriage. The moment a baby was introduced into the narrative, the adultery was instantly forgiven and rebranded as a divine intervention. Then, the final blow landed. My mother, Brenda, entered the chat. She did not send a private message. She addressed the entire group, her words dripping with toxic religious justification. Brenda wrote that she was absolutely overflowing with joy to finally become a grandmother. She proclaimed that the family needed to immediately rally around Monique during this delicate time to protect her from any negative energy or jealousy. She completely erased my existence from the family dynamic in a single paragraph. And then, as if to twist the knife as deeply as humanly possible, Brenda actually asked the group to start suggesting dates for a lavish baby shower, stating she wanted to host the event at our church fellowship hall next month. They were eagerly stepping over the bleeding corpse of my marriage to plan a party for my betrayers. I stared at the screen, reading the congratulations and the praises. A weaker woman would have typed out a furious defense. A weaker woman would have called her mother screaming, demanding loyalty, or begging the extended family to see the truth. But I did not type a single word. I did not shed a single tear. The deep, heavy sadness that had been lingering in my chest completely evaporated, replaced by a crystalline, absolute focus. They wanted to play the holy, blessed family on a public forum while hiding massive federal crimes in the dark. I was going to let them build their glass house as high as they possibly could, right before I shattered every single pane. I locked my phone, tossed it onto the passenger seat next to the heavy red legal binder, and stepped out of my car. I walked through the double glass doors of the police precinct with my head held high. I approached the front desk and requested to speak with a financial crimes detective. I was escorted into a quiet, stark interview room where I sat across from a seasoned investigator. I did not mention the affair, the ultrasound, or the family group chat. I kept my emotions entirely out of the room. I simply opened the binder and laid out the undeniable documented proof of felony identity theft and federal wire fraud. I showed the detective the forged signatures, the unauthorized credit inquiries, and the digital tracking data pointing directly to Terrence. The detective took one look at the sheer volume of organized evidence and immediately escalated the file. He assured me that a formal criminal investigation would be opened by the end of the week. I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked out of the station. I had just lit the fuse. Now, I just had to wait for the explosion. I drove back to my house, the property I had purchased entirely with my own money years before I ever met Terrence. The neighborhood was quiet, the evening settling over the manicured lawns. I walked through my front door, expecting a moment of peace to gather my thoughts. Instead, my tablet chimed from the kitchen island. It was an urgent email notification from my personal attorney. I opened the message and found a forwarded legal document sent directly from Vincent Caldwell, Terrence's aggressive divorce lawyer. The subject line read, "Urgent ex parte motion and demand to vacate." I downloaded the attached PDF and read the contents while standing in the center of my kitchen. Terrence was not just playing defense anymore. Emboldened by Monique's public pregnancy announcement and the overwhelming support of my mother's congregation, he was going on the offensive with absolute zero shame. The legal letter was a formal demand that I vacate the marital residence within 72 hours. Vincent Caldwell had drafted a horrific, manipulative argument claiming that because Terrence was now expecting a child, he required immediate, exclusive possession of the four-bedroom house to prepare a suitable nursery and provide a stable environment for his new family. The document actually stated that my continued presence in the home was creating a hostile and toxic environment that was detrimental to the unborn baby's development. They were trying to use the pregnancy to kick me out of my own house. Terrence wanted to move his pregnant mistress, my own sister, into the home I paid for, sleep in the bed I bought, and raise their child under my roof. The audacity was so monumental, it almost felt entirely surreal. He truly believed that the legal system would favor a new father and force the high-earning, childless wife out into the cold. I set the tablet down on the marble counter and let out a sharp, cold laugh that echoed through the empty kitchen. Terrence had clearly lied to his bulldog attorney. He had let Vincent Caldwell believe that this house was joint marital property subject to equitable distribution. He had conveniently forgotten to mention the airtight, irrevocable premarital trust I had forced him to sign 10 years ago, completely shielding this specific property from any divorce proceedings. He thought he had me cornered. He thought the ultrasound photo was an ultimate shield that would protect him from my wrath and grant him the keys to my kingdom. He believed that public opinion and family pressure would force me into total submission. I poured myself a glass of iced water, looking around my pristine, quiet home. Let them plan their baby shower. Let them pick out nursery paint colors. Let them celebrate their stolen victory in the family group chat. Terrence and Monique were operating on borrowed time and stolen money, entirely unaware that the federal government was already looking into their hidden accounts. The pressure was mounting, but I knew I needed to dig deeper into this supposed miracle baby, because in my experience with my sister, absolutely nothing she presented to the world was ever exactly as it seemed. For the next 48 hours, my cell phone became an absolute weapon of psychological warfare. My mother had successfully mobilized her religious echo chamber, and the flying monkeys descended upon me with a terrifying, righteous vengeance. The family group chat was not enough for them. They needed to ensure I was thoroughly crushed into submission. My voicemail inbox began to fill up rapidly, vibrating constantly against my kitchen counter. I did not answer a single call. I simply let them roll to voicemail, pouring myself a cup of black coffee and listening to the audio transcripts as they populated on my screen. The first message was from Aunt Shirley, my mother's older sister, who had always viewed my financial independence as an arrogant rejection of traditional family values. Her voice dripped with that specific brand of condescending Southern church sympathy that was actually designed to draw blood. "Jada, baby, I know your heart is hurting right now," she crooned into the receiver. "But you have to search your soul and repent for this jealousy. You prioritized your money over your marriage, and now God is blessing your sister with the family you refused to build. You need to forgive her, Jada. You need to be the bigger person and step aside so this innocent unborn child can have a proper home." The next voicemail was from Deacon Miller, a man who had known me since I was a teenager in the youth choir. "Sister Jada, the Lord works in ways we do not always understand," he preached through the phone speaker. "A barren womb is a heavy cross to bear, but do not let it breed bitterness in your spirit. Terrence is going to be a father now. That baby needs a stable roof. Do the Christian thing and vacate the house without causing a shameful legal spectacle." Message after message, the narrative was exactly the same. They had completely absolved my husband of his horrific adultery. They had completely excused my sister for stabbing me in the back. In their twisted, patriarchal worldview, my refusal to have children had invalidated my position as a wife, while Monique's sudden pregnancy had magically elevated her to the status of a blessed matriarch. They honestly expected me to pack my bags, hand over the keys to my custom-built home, and quietly disappear into the background so my betrayers could play house in my living room. The social pressure was immense, designed specifically to break my spirit and force a panicked, emotional reaction. Terrence and Monique were banking on me losing my temper. They wanted me to log on to social media and post a furious, unhinged rant. They wanted me to sound crazy, bitter, and jealous, which would only perfectly validate the exact narrative they had just sold to the entire congregation. But I did not give them a single word. I remained absolutely, terrifyingly silent. I did not post a passive-aggressive quote on my social media pages. I did not text my mother. I did not reply to Aunt Shirley or Deacon Miller. As a wealth manager, I knew that in any high-stakes negotiation, silence is the most devastating armor you can wear. It deprives your enemies of the ammunition they desperately need, leaving them to blindly guess your next move. I let them believe their smear campaign was working. I let them think I was hiding in my bedroom crying over my ruined life. Instead, I was sitting at my home office desk, executing a flawless legal counterstrike. I forwarded the ridiculous ex parte motion and demand to vacate directly to my estate attorney, Evelyn Sterling. Evelyn was a brilliant, ruthless lawyer who had helped me draft my financial architecture 10 years ago. I called her secure line, and she answered immediately, having already reviewed the document from Terrence's attorney, Vincent Caldwell. Evelyn was actually laughing when she picked up the phone. She could not believe the sheer amateurish audacity of Caldwell's filing. Terrence had clearly lied to his own legal counsel, telling Caldwell that our home was a joint marital asset. He was trying to use the impending arrival of a baby to claim emergency exclusive occupancy. I gave Evelyn the green light to completely crush him. 10 years ago, right before I married Terrence, I had purchased this sprawling 4-bedroom home entirely in cash, using the massive bonuses I had earned during my first 3 years at the financial firm. But I did not just put my name on the deed. I created the Jada Vanguard Irrevocable Trust. I transferred the total ownership of the property directly into the trust, legally establishing myself as the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. Terrence's name was never on the deed. He had never contributed a single dime to the property taxes, the maintenance, or the renovations. Legally speaking, For the last decade, my husband had simply been a long-term guest living in a corporate-owned property. Evelyn immediately filed a brutal motion to dismiss with prejudice. She attached the certified trust documents, legally proving that Terrence had absolutely zero equity, zero ownership claim, and zero legal standing to request occupancy of the home. But Evelyn did not stop there. Because Caldwell had filed a frivolous motion based on easily disprovable lies, she filed a counter-demand for Terrence to pay all of my legal fees associated with reading and dismissing his ridiculous demand. I legally locked down the house into an impenetrable fortress. Terrence was not getting the keys, he was not getting the equity. He and his pregnant mistress were never going to step foot across my threshold again. The eviction threat was completely neutralized, leaving them scrambling for a place to live. With my physical sanctuary secured, I turned my attention back to the weapon my sister had used to turn my family against me. The miracle baby. I sat back in my leather office chair and picked up my tablet. I opened the family group chat and tapped on the high-resolution ultrasound photograph Monique had proudly posted. I cast the image directly onto my massive 32-inch high-definition desktop monitor. The grainy, black-and-white medical scan filled the entire screen. For 35 years, I had watched Monique manipulate our mother, our relatives, and eventually her own husband. My sister never did anything that required genuine effort or physical sacrifice. She hated gaining weight, she hated physical discomfort. The idea of her willingly ruining her surgically enhanced, perfectly contoured body with a real pregnancy felt incredibly out of character. She was deeply vain and obsessed with her physical appearance. Yet, here was a sonogram, complete with her name typed neatly in the top left corner. I leaned forward, my eyes scanning the digital artifact with the exact same ruthless precision I used to audit fraudulent corporate tax returns. I ignored the shadowy shape of the fetus in the center and focused entirely on the metadata printed along the outer edges of the scan. Medical imaging software automatically stamps specific, unalterable data onto every single frame. I looked at the top right corner. The printed date of the ultrasound was September 12th. My analytical mind immediately snagged on that specific date. Something about the timeline felt fundamentally wrong. I pulled up the calendar application on my phone and started doing the math. If she was 12 weeks pregnant today, the date of conception would have been sometime in early August. That timeline perfectly aligned with their secret trips to Miami. But that was not what was bothering me. It was the date of the scan itself, September 12th. I minimized the ultrasound photo and quickly opened the encrypted digital folder containing the massive forensic financial audit Greg and I had compiled at the coffee shop. I opened the master spreadsheet detailing every single stolen dollar from Desmond Consulting, the secret shell limited liability company Terrence and Monique had created. I scrolled rapidly down the list of fraudulent vendor payouts, searching for September 12th. My breath caught in my throat. I stopped scrolling. There it was. On September 12th, the exact same day Monique supposedly had this emotional, life-changing ultrasound appointment, the Shell Company credit card had been charged for a massive, unexplainable expense. It was not a charge for an obstetrician. It was not a copay for a maternal fetal medicine specialist. It was a cleared transaction for $28,000. I stared at the staggering number, my pulse pounding loudly in my ears. $28,000 is not the cost of a routine prenatal checkup. It is not the cost of a standard medical consultation. That specific financial figure belonged to the world of elective, high-end private medicine. I looked back at the ultrasound photo on my monitor. I looked at the font used to spell out Monique's name in the corner. I squinted, leaning inches away from the glass screen. The pixels around her printed name looked slightly blurred, while the rest of the text on the scan was razor-sharp. It was incredibly subtle, but to an eye trained to catch forged financial signatures, the digital manipulation was glaringly obvious. My sister had not gone to a prenatal clinic on September 12th. She had gone somewhere else entirely, and she had used $28,000 of stolen corporate funds to pay for it. The miracle baby that had turned my entire family against me was nothing more than a desperate, digital illusion. The smear campaign was built on a massive, expensive lie, and I was about to find the exact receipt that would expose her fraud to the entire world. I did not blink. I stared at the $28,000 transaction line item until the numbers seemed to burn themselves directly into my retinas. The vendor name listed next to the massive charge was abbreviated as AE Aesthetics Institute. It sounded incredibly vague, perfectly designed to look like a standard corporate consulting expense to an untrained eye scanning a ledger. But I was not an untrained eye. I opened a new browser tab and ran a deep web search on the vendor identification number attached to that specific transaction. It took less than 2 minutes to bypass the corporate abbreviation and pull the actual registered business license. AE Aesthetics Institute was not a consulting firm. It was the parent billing company for an ultra-exclusive, high-profile plastic surgery center located right in the heart of Miami. It was the exact same city where Terrence and my sister had been conducting their secret affair. I clicked on the clinic's public website. The homepage was plastered with images of perfectly contoured models lounging by pristine infinity pools. I navigated to their list of surgical services and scanned the premium pricing tiers. $28,000 was their exact baseline package for a comprehensive, full-body cosmetic revision. The surgical procedure included aggressive liposuction, an abdominal tuck, and custom contouring implants. The truth hit me with the force of a freight train. Monique was not pregnant. She had never been pregnant. While she was claiming to be suffering from severe morning sickness and asking our mother for daily prayers in the group chat, she was actually recovering from a massive, highly invasive cosmetic surgery. A surgery funded entirely by the money she and Terrence had systematically embezzled from Greg's commercial real estate company. Everything instantly clicked into place. The timeline of her sudden disappearance from social media, her supposed fatigue, and her refusal to leave my mother's house for the last 2 weeks perfectly aligned with a standard post-operative recovery window. She needed a reason to be bloated, to be resting in bed all day, and to demand constant sympathy from the people around her without raising any suspicions about her physical condition. But to completely destroy her fake narrative, I needed undeniable proof that the ultrasound image itself was a digital forgery. The clinic receipt proved she spent stolen corporate money on a mommy makeover, but the deeply religious members of my extended family would still need to see the exact origin of that baby picture before they believed a single word against her. They were highly conditioned to protect the golden child at all costs. I returned to the high-resolution ultrasound image saved on my desktop monitor. I opened a sophisticated photo editing application and meticulously cropped the image, completely cutting out the poorly blurred text where Monique had aggressively stamped her own name. I wanted the raw, unaltered pixels of the medical scan. I uploaded the cropped image into a premium reverse image search database, a professional tool I frequently use to verify the authenticity of corporate assets during major financial mergers. The search engine initiated its scan, scouring billions of indexed photographs across the internet. A green progress bar ticked slowly across my screen. 10%, 50%, 90%. The results populated instantly. There were 0 hits in any official medical journals or stock photography websites, but there was one exact 100% match linked directly to a public social media profile. I clicked the hyperlink. It redirected me straight to a Facebook post dated exactly 3 years ago. I looked at the profile name and let out a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed through my quiet home office. The profile belonged to a woman named Chloe. Chloe was Monique's former college roommate, a girl who used to come to our house for Thanksgiving dinners before Monique abruptly stopped speaking to her over some petty, manufactured drama. There, perfectly preserved on Chloe's public timeline, was the exact same ultrasound picture. Every single shadow, every curve of the tiny fetus, every digital artifact matched identically. But in Chloe's original post, the name typed in the top left corner of the medical monitor was clear and completely legible. It did not say Monique. It said Chloe. Below the image, Chloe had written a heartfelt caption announcing the impending arrival of her first child, complete with the exact same praying hand emojis my sister had just used to manipulate our family. Monique had literally gone onto her estranged friend's social media page, downloaded a 3-year-old ultrasound photograph, sloppily pasted her own name over the original medical text, and presented it to our entire church congregation as a divine miracle from God. The sheer, terrifying depths of her narcissism were fully exposed on my monitor. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, piecing together the psychology of her desperate strategy. Monique was backed into a massive, inescapable corner. Greg had kicked her out of her luxurious mansion and completely frozen her endless supply of limitless credit cards. Terrence had just discovered that his forged loan application was blocked and that his access to my wealth was permanently severed. They were both functionally broke, homeless, and staring down the barrel of a massive public scandal. Monique knew that the second the truth about the affair and the embezzlement came out, our mother would finally be forced to abandon her. Brenda cared about her prestigious church status more than anything else in the world, and shielding a cheating, thieving daughter who destroyed a successful marriage would permanently destroy her social standing. Monique needed an ultimate, impenetrable shield. She needed something that would force Brenda to fiercely protect her, something that would command the church elders to surround her with sympathy, and something that would legally pressure me into backing off my divorce terms. A fake pregnancy was the perfect weapon. In my mother's deeply traditional patriarchal worldview, an unborn child erased all previous sins. It turned Monique from a home-wrecking thief into a vulnerable, expectant mother who required immediate shelter and financial support. It also conveniently bound Terrence to her, ensuring he would not panic and abandon her when the federal authorities inevitably came knocking on their door. She had successfully manipulated over 40 people in a matter of minutes. She had completely weaponized my family's religious beliefs against me, twisting their faith to secure her own survival. She truly thought she was an absolute genius playing a flawless game of chess. But she had made a fatal miscalculation. She assumed I would react with pure emotion. She assumed I would cry, scream, and throw a very public tantrum in the group chat that would only validate her claims that I was unstable and bitterly jealous. She never considered the fact that I would respond with cold, forensic precision. I took meticulous, time-stamped screenshots of Chloe's original Facebook post. I captured the web address, the upload date, the comments from her family, and the unaltered ultrasound image. I downloaded the high-resolution copies and placed them directly into a new, heavily encrypted folder on my secure server. I labeled the digital folder the Gala. I added the $28,000 cosmetic surgery receipt from the shell company's credit card statements right next to the stolen baby pictures. The trap was now fully loaded and armed. I had the financial evidence to completely destroy their freedom, and I had the digital evidence to entirely obliterate their social standing. Every single lie they had told to isolate me was now fully documented and ready to be weaponized on a massive scale. I shut down my computer monitors and walked out of my home office. The house was completely silent, providing a stark contrast to the chaotic storm currently raging in my extended family's group chat. I walked into my spacious kitchen, poured the rest of my cold coffee down the sink, and poured myself a tall glass of expensive red wine. I took a slow sip, letting the rich, bold flavor settle on my tongue. For my entire life, Brenda had demanded that I step aside and make room for Monique. She had demanded that I lower my voice, shrink my ambitions, and sacrifice my own hard-earned happiness to keep my sister comfortable. Now, Brenda was demanding that I hand over my own home for the sake of a fake baby. I was officially done shrinking. I was done sacrificing myself on the altar of family peace. If my family wanted a public spectacle, I was going to give them a performance they would never, ever forget. I was going to let them buy the expensive baby shower gifts. I was going to let Terrence brag to his corporate friends about his newfound fatherhood. I was going to let my mother parade my sister around the church congregation like a glowing symbol of divine grace. I was going to let them climb all the way to the very top of their delusional pedestal, because the higher they climbed, the harder they were going to hit the concrete when I finally pulled the rug out from under them, and I knew exactly where and when I was going to do it. The family reunion gala was rapidly approaching, and I was going to ensure it was the most memorable event our family had ever hosted. 2 weeks had passed since I discovered the $28,000 cosmetic surgery receipt and the stolen ultrasound photograph. The highly anticipated family reunion gala was now exactly 48 hours away. For my mother, Brenda, this gala was not just a simple family gathering. It was her crowning social achievement of the year. She had spent the last 12 months meticulously organizing the catered menu, the floral arrangements, and the seating charts at the city's most exclusive banquet hall. It was her opportunity to parade her perfectly curated family in front of the entire church congregation and our extended relatives, basking in their admiration and envy. And now, thanks to Monique's miraculous fake pregnancy, Brenda had the ultimate centerpiece for her grand event. I was sitting at my kitchen island, reviewing a quarterly report for a client, when my cell phone vibrated against the marble countertop. The screen illuminated with a direct text message from my mother. It was the first time she had reached out to me individually since I kicked her and Monique out of my house. I picked up the device, fully expecting a list of demands regarding the divorce proceedings. Instead, I read a message so dripping with cruel, deliberate alienation that it would have shattered the heart of the woman I was just a month ago. "Do not come to the gala," Brenda wrote. "I have already spoken to the venue and had your name removed from the guest list. You will only upset your sister and her baby with your negative energy. This is her moment to celebrate her new family, and I will not allow your bitterness to ruin her special night. Stay home, Jada." I read the words twice, letting the sheer audacity wash over me. She was officially disinviting her eldest daughter from a family reunion to protect the fragile feelings of the daughter who had just destroyed my marriage. Brenda was drawing a permanent line in the sand. She had chosen her side, completely discarding me to maintain the illusion of Monique's perfection. She truly believed that rejecting me from her social event was the ultimate punishment. She thought I would sit in my empty house weeping over my exclusion, desperate for her conditional love. I did not feel rejected. I felt incredibly liberated. She had just handed me the absolute perfect opening. I tapped the reply field on my screen. I did not argue. I did not ask for an explanation or demand my rightful place at the table. I simply typed a brief, chilling response that I knew would send a ripple of intense anxiety right down her spine. "I would not miss it for the world," I replied. "I have a very special gift for the parents-to-be." I hit send and immediately switched my phone to airplane mode, completely cutting off whatever frantic, demanding response she was inevitably going to fire back. I did not care about her guest list. I did not care about her venue security. I was a senior wealth manager who negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions for breakfast. A pair of rented security guards at a banquet hall door were not going to stop me from delivering my final presentation. The next morning, 24 hours before the gala, I drove downtown to finalize the absolute destruction of my husband and my sister. I parked in the underground VIP garage of a massive glass skyscraper and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. This was the headquarters of Greg's elite corporate legal team. The receptionist recognized me immediately and escorted me into a sprawling, soundproof conference room overlooking the city harbor. Greg was already sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table, flanked by three of the most ruthless, expensive corporate litigators in the state. Greg looked like a man who had not slept in days, but his eyes were bright with a dangerous, predatory anticipation. The shattered, heartbroken husband was entirely gone. In his place was a titan of industry, preparing to liquidate a massive liability. We got right down to business. The lead attorney slid a thick, bound legal dossier across the polished wood toward me. It was the finalized federal subpoena. The authorities had taken the financial evidence I provided to the police precinct, corroborated it with Greg's internal corporate audit, and authorized an immediate, sweeping federal injunction. The documents were breathtaking in their thoroughness. The federal court had officially frozen every single bank account associated with Desmond Consulting. They had placed an absolute legal lock on the luxury downtown condominium Terrence and Monique had purchased with our stolen funds. But the most devastating piece of paper in that entire dossier was the criminal summons. Terrence was being formally served with federal charges for wire fraud, identity theft, and corporate embezzlement. The penalty for his crimes carried a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary. Greg and I spent 2 hours reviewing the exact timeline of execution. We mapped out the strategy with the cold, calculated precision of a military operation. I was going to enter the banquet hall first. I would take the stage, expose the fake pregnancy, and publicly deliver the federal subpoena directly into Terrence's hands. The sheer shock of the public exposure would paralyze them. Then, Greg would make his entrance. He would walk into the room with his corporate attorneys and serve Monique with a devastating civil lawsuit for corporate fraud, officially stripping her of every single asset she possessed and leaving her with absolutely nothing. "Everything is locked and loaded," Greg said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble as he closed the master file. "My team has already coordinated with the venue management. We own the building for the night. Nobody is stopping you from getting on that stage, Jada." I looked at Greg, feeling a profound sense of mutual respect. We had both been taken for granted. We had both been used as human ATMs by two incredibly selfish, arrogant parasites. But tomorrow night, the bank was foreclosing on them both. I left the law firm and drove straight to an upscale boutique in the high-end shopping district. If I was going to stand in front of 150 people and burn my family's toxic legacy to the ground, I was going to look absolutely flawless doing it. I spent an hour working with a private stylist. I did not want a dress that screamed for attention. I wanted a garment that radiated absolute power, control, and untouchable wealth. I selected a stunning, tailored emerald green gown. The color was rich, vibrant, and incredibly sharp. It fit my body with architectural precision. I paired it with a pair of classic diamond drop earrings and sleek, towering black stiletto heels. I wanted Terrence to look at me and immediately realize the massive, irreplaceable caliber of the woman he had just thrown away. I wanted Monique to look at me and feel her deep, pathetic insecurities rise up and choke her. I returned to my pristine, quiet home as the sun began to set on the eve of the gala. I walked into my home office and prepared my gift. I took the thick, terrifying federal subpoena and slid it carefully into a high-quality, heavy manila envelope. I sealed the clasp tight. Next, I took the high-resolution screenshots of Chloe's original Facebook ultrasound post, along with the massive $28,000 cosmetic surgery receipt from the Miami clinic. I loaded those specific digital files onto a secure, encrypted flash drive. I slipped the drive into my designer evening clutch alongside my favorite shade of dark red lipstick. The house was completely silent. I stood in the center of my massive living room, looking around at the beautiful life I had built with my own two hands. For 35 years, I had allowed my mother to convince me that I was somehow defective because I did not cater to her golden child. I had allowed my husband to make me feel guilty for my ambition and my success. I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of their expectations, their secret debts, and their emotional manipulations. But tonight, the air in my home felt incredibly light. The storm was currently brewing just outside my front door, but inside, I was experiencing the most profound calm of my entire life. The anxiety of being the family scapegoat had completely vanished. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked out onto my back patio, and looked up at the clear night sky. Tomorrow night, my mother was expecting me to cower in the shadows. Terrence was expecting me to quietly surrender my home to his new, fraudulent family. Monique was expecting to be crowned the queen of the church congregation, draped in stolen money and fake sympathy. They were all marching happily toward their grand celebration, entirely oblivious to the massive trap waiting for them. I took a deep breath of the cool evening air. The dominoes were lined up perfectly. All I had to do was walk into that banquet hall and push the very first one over. The drive to the city felt incredibly short. I pulled my car up to the valet stand outside the sprawling columns of the Grand Marquis Pavilion. This was the most exclusive banquet hall in our district. A venue my mother had booked a year in advance to ensure our family reunion was the absolute pinnacle of the social season. I handed my keys to the young attendant, stepped out into the humid evening air, and smoothed the fabric of my emerald green gown. The heavy designer silk clung to me perfectly, radiating an icy, untouchable elegance. I gripped my evening clutch, feeling the hard rectangular edge of the encrypted flash drive and the thick manila envelope resting securely inside. I walked through the massive glass double doors and entered the grand foyer. The muffled sounds of a live jazz band, clinking crystal glasses, and loud, joyful chatter echoed from the main ballroom. I paused at the coat check, taking a deep breath. For my entire life, I had walked into these family gatherings, carrying the heavy, invisible burden of my mother's expectations. I had always worn muted colors, kept my opinions to myself, and quietly paid for whatever unforeseen expenses Brendan needed covered. I had been the silent sponsor of their perfect family image. But tonight, I was the executioner. I pushed open the heavy oak doors leading into the main ballroom. The sheer scale of my mother's vanity was on full display. Massive centerpieces of white roses and imported orchids sat on 30 round tables. Over 150 relatives, church members, and influential family friends were dressed in their absolute best, sipping expensive champagne under the glow of 3 massive crystal chandeliers. I stood near the entrance, completely unnoticed for the first few seconds, allowing my eyes to scan the room. I immediately spotted the center of attention. Monique was standing near the head table, surrounded by a tight circle of doting aunts and church elders. She was wearing a tight, champagne-colored silk dress, specifically designed to accentuate her midsection. She had one manicured hand resting delicately on her completely flat stomach, constantly rubbing a non-existent baby bump with a practiced maternal gentleness. She was throwing her head back, laughing at a joke, playing the role of the glowing Blessed Mother-to-be. Standing right beside her, playing the part of the devoted and fiercely protective patriarch, was Terence. He had his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. He was wearing a brand new tailored tuxedo, likely purchased with the last of his hidden commission money before the federal freeze locked his accounts. He was leaning in, nodding respectfully, as Deacon Miller patted him on the shoulder, welcoming him into the brotherhood of fatherhood. And hovering just a few feet away was my mother. Brenda was in her element, wearing a sparkling silver gown, holding a glass of sparkling cider, and beaming with absolute, unadulterated pride. She was directing the venue photographer, making sure every single angle of her golden child and her stolen son-in-law was perfectly captured for the family archives. I took my first step into the room. The sharp, heavy click of my stiletto heels against the polished marble floor seemed to cut straight through the jazz music. Aunt Shirley was the first person to notice me. She was standing near the dessert fountain, holding a plate of appetizers. Ew. She turned her head, her eyes widening in absolute shock as she took in my appearance. She actually dropped a silver spoon onto the floor. The loud clatter caused the people next to her to turn. Like a ripple effect moving across a pond, the conversation in the ballroom began to die down. Heads turned one by one. The laughter faded. The jazz band, sensing the sudden heavy shift in the atmosphere, awkwardly trailed off, leaving only the soft hum of the bass guitar. Within 10 seconds, a room of 150 people went completely, terrifyingly silent. I walked slowly and deliberately across the floor. I did not look down. I did not shrink. I kept my chin high, my posture perfectly straight, letting the vibrant emerald green of my dress command the entire space. The church members who had left me those vicious, condemning voicemails just days ago actually stepped aside, physically parting like the Red Sea to let me through. They stared at me with a mixture of horror and deep confusion. I did not look like a bitter, barren, heartbroken woman. I looked like a queen walking into a room she entirely owned. Brenda finally turned around. The proud, beaming smile instantly fell from her face, replaced by a mask of sheer panic and furious indignation. The blood rushed to her cheeks, turning her makeup a harsh, mottled red. She shoved her glass into the hands of a nearby waiter and marched directly toward me, determined to intercept me before I could reach the front of the room. "Jada!" Brenda hissed, her voice a harsh, venomous whisper designed not to echo. "What on earth are you doing here? I explicitly told you that you were banned from this event. You are going to ruin your sister's night. Turn around and walk out those doors right now before I have the venue security forcefully remove you." I did not stop walking. I did not even break my stride. As she stepped directly into my path, I simply sidestepped her with effortless grace, treating her like a minor piece of misplaced furniture. "Excuse me, Mother," I said quietly, my voice carrying the cold, slicing edge of a steel blade. "I have a toast to make." Brenda gasped, reaching out to grab my arm, but I was already past her. Terrence had finally spotted me. The smug, confident smile on his face completely collapsed. His hand dropped away from Monique's waist. He took a terrified step backward, bumping into the head table. Monique turned, saw me approaching the stage, and her face instantly drained of all color. The fake maternal glow completely vanished, replaced by the panicked realization that her primary victim was no longer playing by the rules. I walked up the 3 short steps to the elevated stage. The venue's master of ceremonies, a man hired by my mother to run the timeline, was standing frozen near the podium. I reached out, took the microphone directly from his trembling hand, and gave him a polite smile that sent him scurrying off the stage entirely. I stepped up to the acrylic podium. Right behind me was a massive, high-definition projector screen that had been displaying a rotating slideshow of our family's history. I reached into my clutch, pulled out the encrypted flash drive, and plugged it directly into the podium's master media console. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, amplified thumps echoed like gunshots through the massive banquet hall. Every single eye in the room was locked onto me. "Good evening, family," I said. My voice was incredibly steady, perfectly modulated, and projected with absolute authority. "I know my presence here tonight is a surprise to many of you. Over the last 2 weeks, I have received dozens of voicemails and messages from the people in this room, demanding that I step aside gracefully. You were told that my marriage ended because I prioritized my career over my husband. You were told that I was a cold, bitter woman who denied Terrence a family, and that my sister Monique simply answered a divine calling to provide him with the child he so desperately deserved." I paused, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence stretch across the room. I looked directly at Deacon Miller, who was staring at the floor, and then at Aunt Shirley, who was gripping her purse like a lifeline. "You were all so incredibly eager to forgive adultery the moment a miracle baby was introduced into the narrative," I continued. "You were so desperate to protect the family image that you completely ignored the betrayal. So, tonight, as we celebrate this beautiful new family dynamic my mother has so proudly orchestrated, I thought it was only fitting that I bring a special gift. I thought we should all take a much closer look at this divine blessing." I tapped the media console. The rotating family slideshow instantly vanished. The massive screen behind me illuminated the entire stage with a bright, glaring white light. The image that appeared was the exact, high-resolution ultrasound photograph Monique had posted in the family group chat. The crowd let out a collective, soft murmur of recognition. "This is the miracle," I announced, pointing to the screen. "A 12-week-old blessing from God. Notice my sister's name perfectly stamped in the top left corner. Notice the date, September 12th. I tapped the console again. The image on the screen shifted. It split perfectly down the middle. On the left side was Monique's ultrasound. On the right side, I projected the full, unedited screenshot of Chloe's 3-year-old Facebook post. The original ultrasound image was identical in every single shadow and curve, but the name in the corner clearly read Chloe, accompanied by a caption dated 3 years ago. The collective gasp from the room was so loud it sounded like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the building. "My sister is not pregnant," I stated, my voice ringing with absolute clarity. "She never was. She stole a medical photograph from her estranged college roommate and forged her own name onto it. She lied to every single person in this room to shield herself from the consequences of sleeping with my husband." Monique let out a loud, high-pitched shriek. She covered her face with both hands, stumbling backward until she hit the edge of the head table. Brenda stood completely paralyzed in the middle of the ballroom floor, her jaw physically hanging open as she stared at the undeniable proof of her golden child's absolute sociopathy. But I was not finished. I tapped the console one more time. The screen shifted again. The baby pictures disappeared, replaced by the massive, itemized billing receipt from the AE Aesthetics Institute in Miami. I had highlighted the total amount in bright yellow, $28,000. On September 12th, the exact day Monique claimed she was sitting in an obstetrician's office looking at her miracle baby, she was actually recovering in a private luxury clinic in Miami, I explained to the horrified crowd. She was having a comprehensive full-body cosmetic revision. A mommy makeover. She needed an excuse to stay in bed and recover, and she needed a weapon to turn this congregation against me. So, she manufactured a pregnancy. Terrence could not take it anymore. The public humiliation was breaking his mind. He lunged forward, scrambling up the stairs to the stage, his face twisted in a mixture of blind panic and fury. "Jada, shut your mouth!" Terrence screamed, reaching out to grab the microphone from my hands. "Turn that screen off right now!" I did not flinch. I did not back away. As he rushed toward me, I reached into my emerald clutch and pulled out the thick, heavy manila envelope. Before he could grab the mic, I stepped forward and slammed the envelope directly into the center of his chest. The physical impact stopped his forward momentum completely. He reflexively grabbed the package, looking down at it in total confusion. "Go ahead, Terrence," I said, stepping right into his personal space. My voice was low, but the microphone picked up every single word, broadcasting our confrontation to the silent room. "Open it. You thought I was going to hand you divorce papers. You thought you were going to drag me through civil court and demand half of my hard-earned money for alimony." Terrence's hands were shaking so violently that he could barely undo the metal clasp. He pulled out the thick stack of legal documents. He stared at the federal seal printed on the very first page. "It is a federal subpoena," I announced to the room, never breaking eye contact with my husband. While my sister and my husband were playing house in Miami, they were actively committing high-level corporate wire fraud. Terrence forged my signature to attempt to steal a $200,000 loan against my assets. But worse than that, he and Monique created a secret shell company. I turned back to the crowd, my eyes finding the terrified faces of my relatives. They embezzled over $300,000 from Monique's husband's commercial real estate firm. They systematically stole that money to purchase a secret, all-cash luxury condominium downtown, where they planned to live happily ever after, once they drained both of their spouses dry. They are not just liars and adulterers. They are federal criminals. The heavy legal documents slipped right through Terrence's trembling fingers. The pages scattered across the wooden floor of the stage. He fell to his knees, his entire body shaking, realizing that his entire life, his freedom, and his future had just been completely obliterated in front of 150 witnesses. The ballroom was so entirely quiet that I could actually hear the sound of my mother hyperventilating near the front row. The perfect, untouchable facade of my family had been burned to the ground. But the execution was not over, because right on cue, The massive double doors at the back of the banquet hall swung open violently, and the final nail in their coffin arrived. The heavy double mahogany doors at the back of the banquet hall swung open with a resounding crash that echoed over the absolute silence of the room. Every head in the congregation snapped toward the entrance. Walking through the archway, flanked by three imposing men in sharp charcoal suits, was Greg. The wealthy, composed commercial real estate developer marched down the center aisle of the ballroom with the terrifying, undeniable presence of a predator cornering its prey. He did not look at the floral centerpieces. He did not look at the terrified church elders. His cold, unblinking gaze was locked entirely on his wife. Monique let out a pathetic, strangled whimper. She scrambled backward, her high heels catching on the hem of her champagne silk dress, nearly pulling the entire tablecloth down with her as she tried to put distance between herself and the man she had robbed. Greg stopped right in front of the head table, blocking her only path of escape. He did not scream. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with the chilling, measured cadence of an executive liquidating a bankrupt asset. "I told you to leave my house," Greg said, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent ballroom. "But I did not tell you that I was finished with you." One of the corporate attorneys stepped forward, holding a massive stack of legal documents bound by a thick blue legal strap. He did not hand them to Monique politely. He dropped them directly onto the table right in front of her. The heavy thud made the crystal champagne flutes rattle violently against the fine china. "Those are civil lawsuits," Greg announced to the stunned crowd, completely exposing her to the people she desperately wanted to impress. "You are being officially sued for corporate fraud, grand larceny, and breach of fiduciary duty. Every single designer bag you own, every piece of jewelry I ever bought you, and every dollar you think you are going to get in our divorce is currently frozen by a federal judge." Monique dropped to her knees right there on the polished marble floor. She reached out, grabbing the perfectly creased fabric of Greg's suit trousers, sobbing hysterically. "Greg, please," she begged, her voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. "I am your wife. You cannot leave me with nothing. I have nowhere to go. Please do not do this to me in front of everyone." Greg looked down at her, his expression completely devoid of mercy. "You stopped being my wife the second you decided to fund your affair with my company's money," he replied coldly. He stepped backward, physically tearing his pant leg from her desperate grip. "You have absolutely nothing." Greg turned his back on her, gave me a single respectful nod of solidarity from across the room, and walked right back out the double doors with his legal team. He left my sister sobbing in a crumpled heap on the floor, stripped of her marriage, her wealth, and her entire fake identity. The reality of the slaughter finally broke my mother out of her paralyzed shock. Brenda could not handle the destruction of her perfect social image. The church congregation she had spent decades trying to impress was currently watching her golden child writhe on the floor like a common criminal. Her entire world was imploding, and in her deeply narcissistic mind, there was only one person to blame. Brenda spun around and marched toward the stage, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She pointed a trembling finger right at my face. "You monster!" Brenda screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet room like a jagged saw. "You evil, vindictive girl! You ruined our family name forever. How could you do this to your own blood? How could you humiliate us in front of our church community? You are dead to me, Jada. You are completely dead to me." I stood behind the acrylic podium, looking down at the woman who had spent 35 years demanding my financial sacrifice while offering absolutely zero maternal protection in return. I did not feel a single ounce of sadness. I did not feel the familiar, suffocating guilt she had weaponized against me my entire life. I felt absolutely nothing but the cold, hard steel of my own independence. I reached into my emerald green clutch one final time. I pulled out a single folded sheet of thick, watermarked paper. I stepped down from the stage, walking directly toward my mother until I was standing just inches away from her furious, flushed face. "You love to talk about sacrifice, Mother," I said quietly, ensuring only she and the immediate front row of church elders could hear my exact words. You love to talk about what we owe this family, so let us talk about your house. Brenda flinched. The screaming instantly stopped. A sudden, terrifying flash of recognition darted across her eyes. 5 years ago, I continued, my voice steady and completely relentless. You took out massive secret loans to fund a lifestyle you absolutely could not afford, just to prove to the women in this church that you were wealthy. When the bank initiated foreclosure proceedings, you came to my office crying. You begged me to save you from the public humiliation of being evicted. You begged me not to tell Monique, because you did not want to ruin her perfect image of you. The church elders standing nearby gasped loudly. Aunt Shirley covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with absolute shock. Brenda started to shake, her confident posture crumbling into a terrified slump. I wrote a check for $300,000 that day, I stated, holding the document up in the bright light of the chandeliers. I paid off your entire mortgage in full. But I did not just pay the bank. I transferred the deed of that property into a private subsidiary trust controlled entirely by me. For 5 years, you have been living rent-free in a house that I own. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She was completely trapped by her own massive hypocrisy. 2 days ago, you stood in my living room and threatened to excommunicate me from this family to protect the people who were actively destroying my life, I said, leaning in slightly. You demanded that I vacate my own home so your cheating daughter could have a place to live. Since you clearly believe that family members should sacrifice their homes for the sake of an illusion, I am sure you will not mind making a sacrifice of your own. I pressed the folded document directly against her chest. She reflexively brought her trembling hands up to hold it. That is a formal, legally binding 30-day notice to vacate the premises, I told her. The property has already been listed for sale. You have exactly 1 month to pack your things and get out of my house. Brenda let out a soft, hollow gasp. Her legs gave out completely, and she collapsed into a nearby dining chair, clutching the eviction notice to her chest as she stared blankly at the floor. The matriarch who had ruled our family with an iron fist of guilt and manipulation was finally dethroned. I did not wait for an apology. I did not wait for the church members to offer their hypocritical prayers or their sudden fake sympathy. I turned my back on the entire ballroom. I walked down the center aisle, my stiletto heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, leaving the wreckage of my toxic family entirely behind me. I pushed open the heavy double doors, stepped out into the cool, refreshing night air, and handed my valet ticket to the attendant. The war was officially over, and I had won everything. The fallout from the gala was absolute, swift, and completely devastating. Terrence never made it back to his temporary motel room that night. He was intercepted by federal agents and formally indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud and identity theft. The moment the federal subpoena became public knowledge, his corporate employer immediately terminated his contract. Facing up to 10 years in a federal penitentiary, Terrence predictably tried to strike a plea deal by turning completely against Monique, providing the authorities with every single detail of her involvement in the embezzlement scheme. The grand, sweeping romance they claimed to share evaporated the second they were forced to face the real consequences of their actions. Monique found herself entirely abandoned. Greg finalized their divorce in record time. Thanks to his ironclad prenuptial agreement and the undeniable proof of her felony fraud, the judge awarded her absolutely zero alimony. Greg legally reclaimed every designer asset she possessed. Stripped of her luxury vehicles, her black cards, and her wealthy husband, my sister was forced to move into a cramped, noisy 2-bedroom apartment in a rundown neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. She had no college degree, no marketable skills, and a pending federal trial hanging over her head. The pampered golden child was finally forced to enter the real world. But the most poetic justice was reserved entirely for my mother. The public humiliation at the gala completely shattered Brenda's social standing. The church congregation, unable to ignore the massive scandal and the undeniable proof of her financial hypocrisy, quietly distanced themselves from her. Nobody offered to help her pack. Nobody offered her a place to stay. When her 30 days were up, Brenda was legally evicted from the sprawling suburban home she loved so much. With her credit ruined and her social circle destroyed, she had absolutely no choice but to move into that tiny, run-down apartment with Monique. The two most toxic, narcissistic women I had ever known were now permanently trapped in a small, suffocating space together, with nobody left to blame for their miserable existence but each other. As for me, I finalized my divorce exactly on my own terms. Vincent Caldwell, the aggressive, predatory lawyer Terrence had hired, dropped him as a client the exact moment the federal criminal charges hit the public record. My prenuptial trust held up flawlessly in court. I walked away from the marriage keeping 100% of my financial assets, my investment portfolios, and the absolute deed to my home. I did not just survive the ultimate betrayal. I surgically and ruthlessly removed every single toxic element from my life, protecting the empire I had built with my own hands. 6 months after the gala, I stood on the back balcony of my newly renovated home. The dark, heavy furniture that Terrence had preferred was completely gone, replaced by bright, airy spaces that reflected my own personal style. The evening air was incredibly warm and peaceful. I held a crystal glass of expensive red wine, looking out over the quiet, manicured landscaping of my backyard. I took a slow sip of the wine, reflecting on the absolute chaos of the past year. For my entire life, I had believed that family was defined entirely by bloodlines and mandatory loyalty. I had believed that loving someone meant constantly sacrificing my own peace to keep them comfortable. But standing there in the quiet sanctuary of my own making, I finally understood the truth. True family is not an obligation you are born into. It is about mutual respect, unwavering loyalty, and the profound peace that comes from walking entirely away from the people who continuously take you for granted. My cell phone rested on the glass patio table next to me. The screen suddenly lit up, vibrating softly against the surface. I looked down and saw a blocked number attempting to break through my security settings. It was my mother, trying to reach out for the 100th time since she was evicted, undoubtedly looking for another handout or a chance to manipulate her way back into my bank account. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I simply reached over, pressed the power button, and turned the device completely off. The screen faded to black, returning the evening to its perfect, undisturbed tranquility. I leaned back against the railing, taking another sip of my wine as the stars began to appear in the night sky. Silence, I finally realized, was the absolute ultimate luxury, and I had paid for it in full. The most profound lesson I learned from this nightmare is that blood does not automatically make someone family. For years, I allowed my mother's expectations and my sister's entitlement to dictate my worth. I shrunk myself to keep the peace and funded my own disrespect. But the moment I stopped protecting the people who were actively destroying me, I found my true power. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you, and you should never set yourself on fire just to keep toxic people warm. True liberation comes when you finally choose your own peace over their conditional approval. Have you ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below, and please hit like and subscribe if you believe in reclaiming your power.